The following records do not exist. Part 2. The Big Lead-Up. Public opinion wins war. General Dwight Eisenhower. Sometimes the effect of an error can be larger than the error itself. We shouldn't unearth the past except when new events remind us that old mistakes were not just a matter of coincidence. Saddam Hussein to April Glaspie, U.S. Ambassador to Baghdad, speaking about Iran Gate, 7/25/90. In 1960, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, Iran, and Iraq, the Gulf countries that collectively controlled roughly 3/4 of the world's oil reserves, founded the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC, to mitigate the influence of Western multinational corporations' manipulation and control of global oil prices. OPEC nations sought to stabilize oil prices and strengthen and assert member countries' independence and control of their own national resources and economy. After OPEC nationalized their natural resources and placed an embargo on sales to the U.S. in the 1970s, the availability and cost of oil skyrocketed worldwide. In October 1977, Iranian demonstrations began against the Shah, installed in the coup d'etat by the UK and the USA in 1953, and continued until he was forced to flee to America in 1979, where he was treated for cancer. Iranians demanded the Shah be returned to face trial and execution, to no avail. In April 1979, Iranians voted to become an Islamic republic, and that December, the Ayatollah Khomeini, who had led the Iranian Revolution, became supreme leader. During the Iranian Revolution, existing tensions concerning long-standing border disputes between Iran and Iraq increased, and Iraq, along with other neighboring countries including Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, feared Iran's revolutionary climate might spread and incite similar dissent within their own territories. Iran, which shared a border not only with Iraq but also with the Soviet Union, held high strategic value in the eyes of U.S. Cold Warriors. U.S. fears of Soviet encroachment into Afghanistan and the Persian Gulf, as well as anxieties over the supply and price of oil, which had risen during the Iranian Revolution, heightened after the Ayatollah Khomeini deposed the Shah, who had maintained a U.S.-approved status quo in the region, albeit a shaky one. In November 1979, Iranian revolutionaries took 55 American diplomats hostage at the American embassy in Tehran, accusing them of being a nest of spies, where they were held for 444 days. The crisis ended with the signing of the Algiers Accords in January 1981, only minutes after the swearing-in of Ronald Reagan as U.S. president. Although no diplomatic relations had existed between the two nations previously, when Iraqi President Saddam Hussein agreed to help the U.S. counter the Iranian revolutionaries, a working relationship was formed. In exchange for Saddam's assistance in the matter, the U.S. provided Iraq with military intelligence, technology, and weapons. The Reagan administration viewed Iraq as a potential key to maintaining stability or hegemony in the Gulf region. Iran's potential destabilization of U.S.-friendly nations such as Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and other Gulf states would undoubtedly threaten vital U.S. oil supplies and push prices even higher. Thus, when Saddam invaded Iran in September 1980, commencing the 8-year Iran-Iraq War, he had the support of neighboring countries and the incoming Reagan administration. In the ensuing years, a number of factors threatened to dampen the budding romance between Iraq and the U.S. The United Nations repeatedly condemned Hussein's regime for human rights violations and other violations of the Geneva Protocol, including the use of chemical weapons. The UN eventually imposed an embargo prohibiting arms sales to Iraq. A standing executive order and the Arms Export Control Act of 1976 prevented the U.S. from selling arms to both Iran and Iraq outright, as did the latter's inclusion on the State Department's 1979 list of nations known to aid and support terrorist organizations. Such considerations prevented the U.S. from overtly providing Iraq with material and economic support. Still, the war was good for business and led to the substantial increase in the production of oil and a decrease in price, as both adversaries began to produce and sell more oil to help finance their respective war efforts. In 1982, despite Iraq's known ties to international terrorist organizations, its lengthy record of human rights abuses, and the very vocal objections of Congress, the State Department removed Iraq from the list. In November 1983, President Reagan signed Presidential Directive 114. While the majority of the directive remains classified, it is known that part of it promised that the U.S. would do whatever was necessary to prevent Iraq from losing the war, including the continuation of intelligence and material support. Although Iraq's use of chemical weapons on a nearly daily basis was known to U.S. officials, a meeting between Hussein and Reagan's emissary Donald Rumsfeld in December 1983 strengthened the working relationship between the nations. In 1984, the U.S. initiated Operation Staunch, ostensibly to prevent the sale of weapons to Iran. That same year, the U.S. lifted its ban on arms sales to Iraq. Afterwards, and throughout the following 8 years, the Reagan and Bush administrations provided the Iraqis with over $5 billion of aid, secured vast amounts of loans for them, and sold them an extraordinary arsenal of conventional weapons and weapons systems, including easily weaponized dual-use chemicals. An international weapons-dealing free-for-all ensued. In violation of the UN embargo, and despite their knowledge of Iraq's use of mustard gas and other chemical weapons against the Kurds and Iranian civilians and military, nations around the globe scrambled to sell arms to Iraq, often through clandestine deals with other governments and using multinational cutout companies and other covert channels. Iraq soon earned the dubious distinction of being #1 purchaser of weapons worldwide. In the opinion of one U.S. defense analyst, when it comes to Iraq, everybody's hands were dirty. Iraq's doomsday arsenal, the majority of which had originated in aid or sales from the U.S. and its allies, came to include chemical and biological weapons. According to various reports, Iraq's stockpile of refurbished military hardware included tanks, armored personnel carriers, anti-tank and long-range missiles, rocket launchers, bombers, cluster bombs, MiG warplanes, Mirage jet fighters, rifles, and ammunition. Stockpiled Iraqi weapons of mass destruction included mustard and cyanide gas, nerve gas antidotes, anthrax, West Nile fever germs, botulism, salmonella, E. coli, and other biohorrors similar to tuberculosis, pneumonia, and bubonic plague. New York Times, Confrontation in the Gulf, Experts from Iraqi Document on Meeting with U.S. Envoy, September 23, 1990. Included among the various governments who began selling arms to Iraq were the Soviet Union, the UK, France, China, Chile, West Germany, as well as a number of multinational arms manufacturers and dealers. In 1984 alone, Iraq spent an estimated $14 billion, 60% of their gross national product, on these. Meanwhile, the Iraqi population starved. Weapons sold to Iran eventually found their way to terrorist groups such as Hezbollah. The honeymoon between Iraq and the U.S. began to wane in 1986 during the Iran-Contra scandal, when it was learned that throughout the previous 2 years, in exchange for hostages held by Iran, the U.S. supplied them with weapons to use against Saddam. Burgeoning tensions between Iraq and the U.S. became all the more apparent when, in May 1987, Iraq bombed a U.S. naval ship in the Persian Gulf that had been mistaken for an Iranian commercial vessel, leaving 37 American crew members dead and dozens injured. While the White House officially chalked it up to an unfortunate accident, Reagan publicly blamed Iraq and warned them that the U.S. would retaliate if the attacks continued. Further straining the relationship, in March 1988, the international community condemned Iraq for its scorched earth strategy and use of chemical weapons to kill thousands of dissident Kurds in northern Iraq. While U.S. officials paid lip service to the accusations leveled against Iraq, U.S. policymakers viewed the alliance as vitally important to long-term political and economic objectives and therefore continued to supply Iraq with intelligence, financial, and logistical support. In December 1988, Iraq purchased $1.5 million worth of pesticides from Dow Chemical, despite warnings that they were highly toxic, could result in untold accidental deaths, or their weaponization. In May 1988, Iraq recaptured the territory around its port city of Basra. That August, the UN brokered a ceasefire between Iran and Iraq, ending the war. The alliance between the U.S. and Iraq then began eroding rapidly, as Iraq was now a nation with a massive and still growing arsenal, enormous potential wealth, enormous debt, and a seemingly paranoid leader whose first name means the one who confronts. The relationship between Iraq and Kuwait became terminally hostile when, after the war ended, Kuwait sold its oil for prices lower than OPEC standards and increased its production at rates exceeding OPEC regulations, drilling in disputed border territory with Iraq. To Saddam, the U.S.'s alignment with the United Arab Emirates and Kuwait constituted acts of theft, aggression, and economic warfare that, he said, violated and deprived Iraqis of their basic human rights and standard of living. UN sanctions had effectively deprived Iraq of 70% of their food supply, and in turn the Iraqi government imposed food rationing upon its civilian population. The offenses of the U.S. were all the more egregious, Saddam protested, because for the last 8 years Iraqis had shed rivers of blood to secure the stability of the Gulf region and protect the interests of the U.S. and its allied Arab nations. Saddam began to envision and speak of a grand global conspiracy, orchestrated by Israel and their imperialistic Zionist minions, the U.S. and Britain. In an April 1990 meeting with Senator Bob Dole, Saddam complained of continued U.S. efforts to demonize him in the press, and asked Dole, "Has the Zionist mentality taken control of you to the point that it has deprived you of your humanity?" The grand conspiracy Saddam perceived against him and his nation, however, had not prevented the U.S. from continuing to share intelligence, their conventional and chemical weapons sales to Iraq, or the exporting of these by privately owned U.S. companies. While the U.S. and Iraq remained superficially cordial, the U.S. had long been aware that the relationship was fragile and prepared for the possibility of a future conflict with Iraq by establishing military bases and critical infrastructure throughout the Middle East. In 1988, the Center for Strategic and International Studies began a 2-year study to determine the outcome of engaging in a war with Iraq. The following year, Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney revised the contingency plans of the United States Central Command, CENTCOM, for the defense of the Arabian Peninsula, expanding the plans beyond the scope of countering a Soviet invasion in the region to include the potential of an Iraqi assault on Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. In January 1990, CENTCOM, under the direction of General Norman Schwarzkopf, began running computer-simulated war games to this effect, and soon after increased its military presence in the Gulf region. On July 21, 1990, Saddam positioned troops on the border of Iraq and Kuwait, while the Bush administration's repeated proclamations, echoed by the American media, declared the number of troops amassed on the border to be 100,000, a number that quickly grew to a reported 200,000 and then to 400,000. The more accurate estimate of 20,000 surfaced later. It was at this time, after Saddam's buildup began, that the White House and Pentagon began a sustained propaganda campaign meant to justify and gain popular support for the U.S.'s intended military intervention there. Over the previous 2 years, the American media had increased the frequency and sensationalism of coverage with a decisively anti-Iraq flavor. A major recurring theme seen regularly on American television was Saddam's impressively horrific arsenal of conventional and chemical weapons and claims about his willingness to use them, although the U.S.'s previous and continued sale of conventional and unconventional weapons to Iraq until as late as March 1992 remained virtually unmentioned. During a meeting between Saddam Hussein and the U.S. ambassador to Baghdad on July 25, 1990, Saddam expressed his belief that the motives underlying U.S. hostilities towards Iraq stemmed from its desire, quote, to secure the flow of oil through flexing muscles and pressure. If the U.S. insisted on doing so, Saddam warned, Iraq would respond in kind. Saddam said that although the U.S. military undoubtedly had the ability to inflict significant damage to Iraq, quote, everyone can cause harm according to their ability and their size. Saddam continued, saying that if the U.S. continued to send aircraft and missiles, they risked pushing Iraqis past the point where they would, quote, cease to care and death will be the choice for us. Then we would not care if you fired 100 missiles for each missile we fired, because our life would have no value. While he could not deploy the entire Iraqi army to the U.S., Saddam warned, individual Arabs may reach you. He then announced his intent to restore, one by one, the rights of Iraqis that the U.S. had sold out in exchange for trade agreements with Kuwait, the UAE, and their Zionist ally Israel. Saddam demanded that Kuwait turn over part of their oil fields that he said encroached into Iraqi territory, immediate payment of $2.4 billion in reparations, the cancellation of Iraq's debt to Kuwait, and their promise not to exceed OPEC regulations in the future. Meanwhile, American officials warned the press that Iraq's supergun, the most sophisticated artillery weapon in the world, could be modified to lob chemical shells on U.S. troops in the Gulf. On August 2nd, Saddam moved a reported 100,000 poorly equipped Iraqi troops across the border into Kuwait, whose armed forces totaled a mere 16,000. The invasion drew international condemnation, and the United Nations Security Council immediately voted sanctions against Iraq and demanded they withdraw. The State Department reinstated Iraq as a sponsor of terrorism, and a national security directive issued at this time included a list of U.S. motivations for an expected confrontation with Iraq, the first being access to oil. Bush prohibited all U.S. sales to Iraq and froze all U.S.-held Iraqi assets. Subsequently, the profits of non-OPEC companies soared. Note: journalist John Simpson wrote about later revelations that the CIA had known in advance about Iraq's impending invasion and had deliberately done nothing to prevent it. Operation Desert Shield. Operation Desert Shield began on August 7, 1990, when, without congressional authorization, the Department of Defense dispatched an additional 40,000 troops to Saudi Arabia, along with 100,000 body bags. Americans heard conflicting predictions about expected casualty rates. On one hand, some military officials said that within hours of the conflict's start, Allied field hospital might receive thousands of casualties, and the event of a full-scale war expected up to 10,000 dead U.S. soldiers and 45,000 wounded. Estimated Iraqi casualties were 3 times higher. On the other hand, some insisted the conflict would not be another Vietnam, but rather a clean war with minimal casualties, and that new smart weapons could avoid collateral damage through surgical strikes. Still, it remained unknown if and to what extent Saddam might use chemical weapons against U.S. allied forces, a threat dangled numerous times by the White House and Pentagon. Some media outlets attempted to reassure Americans by reporting that U.S. troops were adequately equipped with protective gear and medical antidotes, and that the desert winds would very likely disperse any nerve agents used. Note: In the city of Samarra, about 45 miles from Baghdad, a chemical warfare facility was reported to be operational and, while claiming to produce insecticides for civilian use, was in reality manufacturing nerve agents that could be used against the U.S. In a nationally televised speech on September 11, 1990, President George H.W. Bush threatened that if Iraq did not withdraw its troops from Kuwait, the U.S. would forcefully remove them. Among the former CIA director's stated objectives for U.S. military intervention in the conflict was the creation of a U.S.-led New World Order. In October, Congress heard heart-wrenching and graphic testimony about the extent of Iraq's atrocities and crimes against humanity, including the now infamous, and since revealed as completely fabricated, baby incubator story. Soon thereafter, Bush declared Saddam Hussein worse than Hitler. During a press conference held near Walt Disney World, Bush, whose comparison of Saddam to Hitler had drawn widespread criticism, attempted to clarify, explaining that while the Holocaust was outrageous, so was Saddam's brutalization of Kuwaiti children. He then awkwardly began to list the ways in which Hitler was kinder and gentler than Saddam. Note: as part of this, a U.S. public relations firm, Hill and Knowlton, concocted stories of Iraqis' atrocities, including the false testimony given to Congress in October 1990 about the slaughter of Kuwaiti infants removed from incubators and left on the floor to die. It was only later, in January 1992, that the doctor who testified about the incubator abuses admitted they had been wholly untrue. Other propaganda contrived by Hill and Knowlton included stories about Iraq's chemical weapons, nuclear capabilities, ability to facilitate terror attacks around the globe, and pictures of the horrors perpetrated by Iraq displayed at the United Nations, the halls of Congress, and television. The media then widely circulated these stories, often quoting White House and Pentagon spokespeople whose frequent mention of them rallied Americans in support of the war. Including among the U.S.'s anti-Iraq propaganda effort was the carefully calculated demonization of Iraqis and the newly reincarnated Adolf Hitler Hussein, the madman, lunatic, monster barbarian, and brutal dictator who followed only the laws of the jungle. Framed as an epic battle between good and evil, the U.S. regularly employed xenophobic, racist, and sexualized rhetoric about Iraq's rape and penetration of Kuwait. Popular culture followed suit, and sales of anti-Iraq and Saddam t-shirts, video games, songs, and other merchandise became a popular fad, as did America's new yellow ribbon fetish. Note: cultural critic Douglas Kellner noted, throughout American history, vengeance for rape, especially the rape of white women by people of color, has been used to legitimize political and military actions against colored people. For Pentagon officials, it was important to win the hearts and minds of the American people and prevent unmanaged media coverage of public dissent from spreading and morphing into Vietnam syndrome. The term, while originally referring to PTSD, had also come to denote a general reluctance among U.S. citizens to enter another prolonged war. The realities of the Vietnam War, as seen on American television, and the ghostly shells of men who did come back alive, had demoralized and repulsed them, and contributed to the formation of a loud, active, and ultimately revolutionary shift in the social fabric of the country. In August 1990, Bush stated, "Whatever else we do, we aren't going to do it the Vietnam way." Rather, the media coverage of this conflict appeared more like an exciting action-adventure movie. Around-the-clock coverage during the lead-up to the U.S. and Allied air assault often featured war journalists holding microphones and cameras and wearing gas masks while perched in tank turrets, charging through the Saudi desert on high-speed joyrides with no enemy in sight. After 13 U.S. Air Force crew members died in an accidental jet crash, the White House implemented a policy of strict control and censorship of the press, citing reasons of national and battlefield operational security, or OPSEC. The new media policy banned coverage of U.S. troops arriving in the Gulf region and the return of dead bodies to the states. Further, the Department of Defense implemented its embedded journalist and press pool protocols, requiring journalists to obtain Pentagon approval before entering the war theater, and once there to be assigned to military minders who would escort them at all times. Those who attempted to break away risked detainment and arrest. Having little access to the battlefield, the majority of coverage and information about the war relied on the DoD's daily press briefings. All written and filmed media reports were subjected to security review and, if found in violation of OPSEC, censored. From November 8th to 10th, Bush announced he was doubling the number of U.S. troops in Saudi Arabia. Among the deployed were covert U.S. Special Forces units and their British counterparts. On November 29th, the UN Security Council issued a deadline of January 15, 1991, for Iraq's withdrawal from Kuwait, authorizing military intervention in the event that he failed to do so. By this time, the Pentagon claimed that 250,000 Iraqi soldiers had massed near the border. As the deadline approached, President Bush informed Americans, along with the rest of the world via television, that "we will not fail." The deadline passed, and Iraq did not withdraw from Kuwait. Just watch CNN. In November 1990, only days away from his long-awaited Special Forces tryout, the primary reason for his reenlistment, McVeigh's unit, along with the rest of Fort Riley's 1st Mechanized Infantry Division, learned of their impending deployment to the Persian Gulf. McVeigh wrote to Steve, telling him that he did not know the details about where exactly in the Gulf he would be or what he would be doing there. All he knew was that he would be in the desert for a while. "You probably know as much as us," he admitted, instructing him to just watch CNN. "They told us today that if any of us were an only child, we wouldn't be deployed to carry on the family name." Several cohorts later recalled how commanders told them that if a ground war were to start, the majority of them, up to 75% even, could die, and described the fear they experienced upon learning this. "If there isn't a war," he wrote, "we stay for 1 year. If there is, I'll probably be back a lot sooner, in a box. Tell your mom to send goodies. A year in the desert is a long time." He continued, writing that on the bright side, he had recently received a promotion to corporal and expected to receive his sergeant stripes shortly. As far as his upcoming Special Forces tryout, McVeigh later told his attorneys that when he learned of his deployment to Iraq, quote, "I thought that was all right. I didn't know what would happen with the Special Forces training. I figured I could just reapply when I got back." Friend and commanding officer Sergeant Weathers said that McVeigh disagreed with the decision to go to war, believing it to just be a political scheme. McVeigh, said Weathers, did not think the United States had any business or interest in Kuwait, but he knew it was his duty to go where he was told, and he went. McVeigh himself later explained that he was aware of the wartime propaganda put forth by the U.S. at the time. Quote, "I remember Bush refusing the Kuwaiti offer to pay each soldier $5,000. He said we weren't mercenaries. I remember Bush's multiple trips/junkets to Kuwait himself to receive gifts, etc." He expanded on this in a letter to his biographers, explaining how, throughout the big lead-up, a lot of rhetoric was flying around, including claims that all Iraqis and Saddam were evil. To him, the formulaic nature and logical progression of these amounted to kill Saddam equals kill Iraqis equals kill the evil/destroy the evil. Always an avid consumer of the news, by the time McVeigh learned about his deployment to the Gulf, he likely saw the few reports published that were critical of the war, like the September 1990 Washington Post article entitled "How Saddam Built His War Machine." West provided much of the necessary technology expertise. Just prior to his execution, McVeigh discussed his perception of Gulf War propaganda on 60 Minutes. He elaborated to his biographers, comparing the type of media hype seen during the big lead-up to the Gulf War to that seen during the Waco siege. He outlined a number of first-hand experiences with wartime propaganda during the Gulf War, about which he said, "All of these experiences gave me a very unique and personal experience with and perspective on wartime propaganda. So imagine my shock and disillusionment when, returning home from such a war, I recognized the same propaganda being utilized against American citizens. First Ruby Ridge, but real bad at Waco. Wartime propaganda being used against Americans." This, McVeigh said, showed him the value of propaganda as a war tool. He then offered another equation to explain. David Koresh equals all Davidians evil. Kill Koresh equals kill Davidians equals destroy the evil. Granted a brief leave prior to his deployment to the Middle East, McVeigh returned home to western New York. Like the other men in his unit, he was afraid and expressed this to the loved ones he visited with there, including the neighbors at whose homes he had taken shelter as a child. Mrs. Dangler, name changed, said, "He told us he knew he was going to come home in a body bag. He was sure he was going to die. I wondered if there was a part of him that may have wanted it to happen." Mrs. McDermott said it was the first time she saw him with tears in his eyes. While most of Charlie Company had already arrived in Saudi Arabia, when his leave was over, McVeigh returned to Fort Riley, where he and 37 others in his platoon remained awaiting deployment orders. In a letter written to Steve on January 6, 1991, he announced his flight to the Gulf would be leaving that night, and a month would pass before he wrote his next letter. During a press conference in early November 1990, Defense Secretary Dick Cheney discussed the buildup and deployment of further troops to the Gulf, and specifically mentioned Fort Riley's famous 1st Mechanized Infantry Division, who were to join other armored units normally stationed in Germany. At some point after he arrived in the Gulf, McVeigh, along with other Bradley operators and teams from Charlie Company and the Marines' 1st and 2nd Divisions, became a crucial component of 7th Corps, a forward armored assault force described as the largest armored corps ever assembled. After an extensive U.S. and Allied air assault, 7th Corps would spearhead the ground war, conducting initial breaching operations into Iraqi-held territory. McVeigh specifically became part of 7th Corps' main effort, Task Force 3/37 or Task Force Iron, Alpha Company, 3rd Platoon. The Gulf War Spectacle. The first casualty when war comes is truth. U.S. Senator Hiram Johnson, 1917. If there is a war and if Bush has his way with the media coverage, the haunting and unforgettable face of battle will be marked for an American public. Patrick Sloyan, Washington Post, January 13, 1991. Thou shalt not be afraid for the terror by night, nor for the arrow that flieth by day, nor for the pestilence that walketh in darkness, nor for the destruction that wasteth at noonday. Psalm 91, reportedly read to U.S. troops on January 1991 as Iraqi Scud missiles targeted Saudi Arabia. New York Times, February 4, 1991. Desert Shield turned into a perfect shitstorm when, on the evening of January 17, 1991, U.S. and Allied forces began a massive aerial assault upon Baghdad and surrounding areas. Suddenly, flashy new U.S. weapons with catchy names, including the Tomahawk, Maverick, and Hellfire missiles, F-16 Falcons, F-1117 stealth bombers, and Cobra and Apache helicopters, disrupted the darkness of the Iraqi night. Its silence, quote, exploded into mind-numbing noise, cars shook with reverberation, the ground was quaking as each new missile struck the city, the structure of buildings swayed and shivered. The spectacular Allied airstrikes were relentless, ceaselessly dropping an estimated 88,500 tons of explosives over the next 42 days in what one journalist described as the greatest bombardment in human history and heaviest bombardment any city on Earth had undergone since the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In violation of international law, the carpet bombings employed fuel-air explosives and napalm and burned through nearly 12 million gallons of fuel per day. Military spokespeople appeared on media outlets explaining that the air assault was necessary to shape the battlefield by destroying Saddam's stockpiles of weapons. Primary targets of the attack included the Iraqi air and naval forces, Scud missile launchers, weapons research facilities, chemical weapons factories, ammunition depots, oil pumping stations, and supply lines in Baghdad and elsewhere, as well as Saddam's command and communication facilities and aircraft and personal bunkers. Among the other ostensible military objectives was the destruction of civilian and military infrastructure throughout Iraq and Kuwait, inducing fear and horror and affecting submissiveness within Iraqi command. While the ground war had not yet started, it must have seemed so to untold numbers of Iraqi soldiers, who immediately began retreating on foot and in mobile convoys, many deserting their posts to join over 1 million Iraqi civilians also attempting to flee targeted areas. As they did so, U.S. pilots rained bombs upon thousands along the highways leading out of Baghdad that quickly filled with bumper-to-bumper traffic. Television viewers at home enjoyed the Pentagon's carefully selected footage of ballistic missiles lighting up the skies of Iraq. The Guardian described the coverage as a hypnotic spectacle of moving graphics and death-dealing explosives, akin to a desensitizing, addictive arcade game. While the Pentagon denied that the U.S. and its allies targeted Iraqi civilians, many died during the air assault. Conspicuously absent from the hypnotic spectacle of U.S. television coverage was any mention of these Iraqi civilian casualties, or the damage to critical civilian infrastructure, including the bombed-out obliterated homes, mosques, and even a baby formula plant, not to mention the shallow and expeditiously dug graves. Fleeing Iraqis and Jordanians told reporters about buses filled with civilians who were strafed by airborne munitions, describing countless burned vehicles and casualties that lined the highways and towns over 75 miles east of the border, deep within Iraq. Saddam responded to the air assault by declaring, "The great showdown has begun, the mother of all battles is underway." He further declared that Iraq would crush the evil and satanic intentions of the White House. In the days to follow, and throughout the duration of the conflict, Iraq reportedly launched a number of Scud missiles into Saudi Arabia and Israel. The U.S. claimed to have neutralized many of these by firing the newly repurposed Patriot missile, the first anti-missile missile. Later, numerous reports called into question the Pentagon's reported accuracy rates for the Patriot and Tomahawk missiles. Note: throughout the Persian Gulf War, military spokespeople and pundits repeatedly claimed that U.S. Patriot missiles were successfully repelling Iraqi Scud warheads fired at Saudi Arabia and Israel, though in later years this claim was hotly contested. In the years to come, various critics, including DoD think tanks, Air Force spokespeople, Israeli Defense Forces, American and Israeli media, and the Congressional Research General Accounting Office, claimed that they had shown anywhere from a 0 to 40% success rate. Israeli military officials claimed the Patriots had caused more damage than they prevented, as, more often than not, they failed to vaporize the Scud, instead blowing them up and scattering Patriot and Scud debris on the ground below. Further, while the Pentagon promised that the new precision-guided smart bombs would reduce civilian casualties, only 9% of bombs dropped by the U.S. were smart. According to the Pentagon, the accuracy rate of the remaining dumb bombs was less than 25%. The success rate of the Tomahawk missiles, estimated by the Pentagon at 98% at the start of the war, dropped to less than 10% by 1999. On January 19, 1991, in the conflict's first publicly known commando operation, U.S. troops raided offshore oil platforms near Kuwait, capturing 12 Iraqis. Iraq threatened to transport their own prisoners, should they take any, to strategic locations to serve as human shields. American media reported that the invading Iraqis had purposely blown up a number of Kuwaiti oil fields, wells, storage tanks holding jet fuel and kerosene, installations and pipelines, and, in an act that constituted a war crime, threatened to blow up more as part of a scorched earth campaign against Kuwait. On January 23rd, an estimated 400 million gallons of crude oil spilled into the Persian Gulf, the biggest oil spill in history at that time. Iraq claimed the spill resulted from U.S./Allied bombings. Whatever the origin of the spill, winds carried the fumes in all directions, and within weeks, southerly winds pushed most of the oil into the Gulf, away from the Saudi coastline, leaving behind birds and other wildlife covered with deadly goo. Neither the raids nor the oil spills affected oil prices, which, while fluctuating, had begun to drop, as the value of the growing military-industrial market stocks rose. On January 26th, Colin Powell, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, authorized U.S. military commanders in the Gulf to use non-lethal riot control gases against Iraqi troops and POWs. Powell described the chemical compounds as basically tear gas and assured the media that their use certainly did not constitute chemical warfare. The non-lethal gases delivered by hand grenades, mortar shells, and aerial bombs, he said, would be useful in urban combat such as house-to-house situations, as they could effectively immobilize individuals, especially escaping or rioting POWs, but was less than explicit about the exact chemical agents the DoD intended or did not intend to use. Critics argued that the use of these gases violated Geneva Convention rules, as well as other restrictions against the use of chemical weapons. Note: the UN held that the use of tear gas and other non-lethal agents was prohibited by the 1925 Geneva Protocol, but during World War II the French used riot control agents, the Germans chlorine, while both sides used mustard gas. An executive order issued by President Gerald Ford in 1975 restricted the use of lethal and non-lethal gases, but the use of riot control agents was reauthorized during the invasion of Panama. Also on January 26th, as U.S. submarines began launching missiles from the Persian Gulf and Red Sea, 75,000 individuals, part of a growing but largely unreported anti-war movement, arrived in D.C. to march at the Capitol. Opposing them were 3,500 pro-war demonstrators. Meanwhile, that same day, anti-war demonstrators blocked the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco. The following day, McVeigh's hometown team, the Buffalo Bills, lost to the New York Giants in the Super Bowl. Note: on February 4, 1991, 3,500 people congregated around the White House to show support for the war and counter the growing numbers of anti-war protesters. According to Douglas Kellner, a critical component of the U.S. Gulf War propaganda machine involved the press pool system and the systematic exclusion of anti-war demonstrators or even dissenting opinions in news coverage. A study by media watchdog group FAIR found that only 29 of the 2,855 minutes of television coverage from August 8 to January 3 addressed opposition to U.S. military intervention in the Gulf. When the anti-war movement did receive coverage, it tended to be negative, depicted them as mobs of unruly anti-American terrorist sympathizers. Still, Kellner says that the night before the war began, 50% of Americans were opposed to it. During the last weeks of January, as Iraqi troops continued their advance into Kuwait, U.S. Marines fired artillery, mortar rounds, and TOW missiles at them and their bunkers. In the parlance of the day, Iraqi forces became bogged down on January 29, 1991, when a Kuwait radio station owned by the CIA encouraged a Shiite uprising in Saudi Arabia, diverting the attention, resources, and manpower of the Iraq army to quell the uprising. Bad company behind enemy lines, sitting ducks, sacrificial lambs, and random death from above. The ongoing Allied air assault cleared the path for the impending ground war, and by February 4, 1991, quote, the last stage of the biggest, fastest deployment and largest logistical move in military history began. More than 500,000 U.S. troops had arrived in the Gulf by this time, part of a growing number poised on the Iraq-Kuwait border. In General Norman Schwarzkopf's war plan, praised by tacticians and military theorists, the 7th Corps 1st Armored Division was to lead the Hail Mary or left hook, northeast through the Iraqi deserts, seeking out and destroying, specifically, the 4 best-paid, equipped, and trained Iraqi divisions, part of the infamous Iraqi Republican Guard. Essential to General Schwarzkopf's Hail Mary operation was the new Bradley Fighting Vehicle, BFV, boldly touted as one of the most extensively tested and safest vehicles at the Army's disposal, and essential to combat power on the ground. Note: by January 17th, the number of combat-ready soldiers from the Army's 1st Infantry Division totaled 23,000, as well as thousands of Bradley fighting vehicles attached to the elite 7th Corps that, along with McVeigh, had begun arriving in early January. In addition to operating the large fleet of frontline advanced moving Bradley vehicles, the 7th Corps, McVeigh included, was responsible for operating the Multiple Launch Rocket System, or MLRS. The Bradley had the capacity to house 1 infantry squad consisting of a vehicle commander, driver, gunner, and up to 7 additional dismount soldiers. The Multiple Launch Rocket System, MLRS, could fire projectiles that, arriving at their intended targets, exploded in midair, sending a spray of smaller bomblets designed to pierce the outside of armored vehicles, or, if they hit the ground, exploded into shrapnel whose radius of destruction spanned the size of an American football field. Bradley manufacturers also claimed the vehicles had the capacity to drive over obstacles 3 feet high, trenches up to 8 feet deep, climate angles of 60 degrees, and were designed with amphibious underwater capabilities. Both the military and the Bradley manufacturer claimed that it had 4 major advantages: mesh coats of low-explosive reactive armor consisting of aluminum and depleted uranium, which added up to 5 tons in weight, lightweight and rapid acceleration capability, thermal optic night sighting systems, and newly designed and more accurate aiming systems. Gunners had an array of weapons at their disposal. Mounted on top of the Bradley was a 25mm cannon, M60 machine gun, and an anti-tank TOW missile system. Thus, McVeigh now found himself in the role of Bradley gunner in one of the war's foremost advanced units tasked with breaching the front lines and trailblazing for the 64-ton Abrams tanks following close behind. As the Bradley driver plowed through the sand, McVeigh, aided by thermal sights, would look for, and if found, blow up landmines, incoming missiles, enemy troops, and their vehicles. Painted on the side of McVeigh's Bradley tank was the name he had given it, Bad Company. On February 16, 1991, about a month after he arrived in Saudi Arabia, McVeigh wrote to Steve, telling him about his recent promotion to E5, Sergeant, and the duties this entailed. "I key the entire task force," he explained. "Of course the glory has a price. Look where I am." He apologized to Steve, writing that although he had a lot he wanted to get off his mind, he could not seem to concentrate. His thoughts, he said, centered on one thing: the combat they had rehearsed during the previous 4 days. "I shouldn't say what I'm about to," McVeigh disclosed, "but we're gonna burst through so fucking quick the Iraqis will think it's a bad dream, and when they blink to wake up, they'll be dead. Other people will brag about being part of the initial attack, but you can't get more spearhead than my vehicle. For now, here's all I can say, so someone knows that if I die it wasn't in the rear echelon. Shot down in a daze of glory. I'll make it through. I have my own fire plan." 3 days later, he wrote his sister, telling her they had been very busy practicing for the attack, and said he was not nervous because, "If it's my time, it's my time." Still, when he wrote her again 2 days later, he hinted at his denied anxiety by signing the letter "Love, Tim," a closing unseen among his countless other letters written both before and after the Gulf War. Cheerleaders for the Bradley sometimes boldly claimed that the ground war depended upon his performance, but despite his training, McVeigh had reason to be anxious. The Bradley was also among the most criticized vehicles in U.S. military history. At the time of the Gulf War, the Bradley remained untested in realistically simulated or actual combat situations. Its known failures and defects included susceptibility to catastrophic chemical fires when hit by anti-armor weapons. The armor shattered, burned, and exploded. Pyrotechnic prowess. The fuel tanks and ammunition exploded easily when hit. Amphibious capabilities, they tended to sink. Agility, they sometimes jammed or abruptly slowed to half speed. Mobility, they often became stuck or dug in. And durability, the door of one fell off after it was rear-ended, leaving those inside to drive over the door repeatedly in an attempt to reflatten it. Note: during Operations Desert Shield and Storm, FMC Corps, the manufacturer of the Bradley, was one of the largest U.S. defense contractors in the Gulf, contracted to supply defense systems and industrial chemicals to clients around the world, replace and supply damaged oil production equipment in Kuwait, petroleum equipment plants in Saudi Arabia, and oil production facilities in Iran. In 1985, after Colonel James Burton, a testing supervisor in the Pentagon's Office of Research and Engineering, filed an internal complaint, Congress leveled heavy criticism against the Bradleys, claiming the Army skewed the results of simulated combat testing of the vehicle, although the Army denied this. Colonel Burton, although commended by Congress for speaking out, was subsequently transferred to Alaska, ultimately leading to his decision to retire early. In early 1989, Saudi Arabia agreed to purchase 200 Bradleys for an estimated $550 million to be received by early 1991. On February 11, 1991, the Wall Street Journal quoted one FMC executive as saying that while the company's profits had taken a turn for the worse, Allied bombs and Iraq's scorched earth policy promised to raise them, and informed reporters of FMC's willingness to provide Kuwait with the equipment they may need if they successfully regained control of their country. In 1992, FMC began building a newer type of Bradley, designed for electronic warfare and outfitted with radio and radar transmission and interception capabilities, described as a combined spy and traffic cop. In 1996, FMC had agreed to pay the U.S. government $13 million for defrauding the government by inflating the costs of the vehicle from 1991 to 1994, allegations that started with another company whistleblower. Robert Niergarter, FMC, sold its operations in 1997. In 1998, after a nearly 12-year-long court battle, $125 million was awarded to the U.S. Army, who still had a reported 9,000 Bradleys in use, as part of a federal jury's verdict against FMC Corporation, who had been contracted with manufacturing and supplying the Bradleys to the Army. The jury found that FMC had misled the Army about the safety of the vehicle. The suit had begun in 1986 when former FMC whistleblower Henry Boisvert complained that the vehicles had not passed all the tests FMC claimed they had. Beginning around February 1, 1991, and continuing until after McVeigh penned his first letters from the Gulf, media outlets reported that the Army was conducting inspections of 300 to 500 of the 2,000 Bradley vehicles in the Gulf. As it turned out, many of the models positioned on the front lines had a possible transmission defect that could reduce the 6,000-pound armored personnel carrier's speed from 40 miles an hour to 10, or cause it to jam completely, essentially rendering those inside sitting ducks in combat situations. Plus, the massive size of the Bradley made it more visible, thus a prime target for improvised explosive devices, IEDs, enemy gunfire, and anti-tank missiles. In addition to this snafu, news outlets also continued to report Army field officers' ongoing investigations concerning the disappearance of more than 50 Bradley vehicles from a base in East Saudi Arabia, the location of the first armored. When contacted by reporters, some officers claimed terrorists stole them. Others said American troops stole them to obtain parts for their own fleet of Bradley vehicles in desperate need of repair. Note, in total, an estimated 2,200 Bradleys were used during the Gulf War aside M1 Abrams tanks, the latter consuming 5 or more gallons of fuel per mile. Other vital military equipment reported missing included an AC-130 plane. The Wall Street Journal reported on February 11th that one commander of a Bradley unit had called the manufacturers, desperately announcing his willingness to pay out of his own pocket for spare parts needed to fix the Bradleys in his fleet. The commander of one Bradley company poised along the Saudi border told reporters that theirs was a destruction mission, expected to result in both extraordinary violence and extensive American casualties. McVeigh later said they were the Army's sacrificial lambs meant to draw enemy fire. One sergeant described what many men in McVeigh's unit recalled, namely commanding officers' warnings that many of them, the majority even, would not survive the ground war's initial assault. Quote, McVeigh got the Bronze Star because when we started the battle, his track was the third one to cross through. We weren't really the advanced forces, we were the guinea pigs they used. They sent us out to test the artillery on the other side, that along with everything else, we were the breach element. The chaplain came up to us and said, well, out of the whole unit, 90% of yous ain't supposed to be here today talking to me. That's a great thing to hear from your chaplain. They told us we were supposed to be dead. The Bradley units were not the only sitting ducks and sacrificial lambs. On February 9, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev expressed that coalition actions in the Gulf exceeded the UN mandate and attempted to mediate by holding discussions with Saddam Hussein in Baghdad. On February 11th, President Bush benevolently announced that neither he nor other coalition leaders were eager to initiate a ground war. 2 days later, in the early hours of February 13th, U.S. stealth fighters dropped a 2,000-pound penetration bomb on a public shelter in Al-Amiria, killing anywhere from 300 to 1,500 Iraqi civilians, mostly women and children. Journalist John Simpson described the gruesome carnage rescue workers found there, including bodies fused together so that they formed entire blocks of flesh, a layer of melted human fat an inch deep lying on the surface of the water pumped in by the firemen. Pentagon spokespeople eventually admitted they had mistakenly identified it as an underground Iraqi military command center. Nevertheless, the Pentagon continued to dismiss subsequent Iraqi claims of Allied attacks on civilians as propaganda. Note, reports about the numbers of casualties in the Iraqi shelter bombing varied. The lowest number, 300, is found in Herbeck and Michel's 2001 book, while a slightly higher number of 500 was reported by USA Today, and the highest number, 1,500, was reported by Ramsey Clark. On February 14th, McVeigh wrote Steve and told him he was moving out in 3 hours to secure Iraqi territory. From February 15th until February 20th, coalition forces conducted decoy attacks in hopes of leading Iraqi commanders to think the main Allied attack would occur along the southern border of Kuwait. Although officially coalition ground troops did not breach Iraqi-held territory until February 23, 1991, General Schwarzkopf acknowledged later that Green Beret Special Forces units were already behind enemy lines in Iraq. Nearby, 3 miles outside the border of Iraq, acting in a supporting role, was McVeigh's platoon, along with others in Task Force Iron. On February 15th, psychological warfare units from the 7th Corps blasted recordings of vehicles moving, while the task force, including the 1st Infantry, part of the ruse, moved north and initiated a premature but pivotal attack. Note, also on February 15th, Iraq announced it would agree to withdraw from Kuwait under the condition that Israel pull out of occupied Arab regions, the Saudis forgive past Iraqi debts, and the coalition foot the bill to rebuild the severely damaged Iraqi infrastructure. Israel and the U.S., however, declined the offer. During the yet unknown decoy attacks, McVeigh wrote Steve and described engaging in aggressive patrols in enemy territory as part of an indirect fire mission. During one mission, he wrote, he was sitting in his Bradley when, through his thermals, he observed an abandoned Chevy truck near an oil pumping station and noticed the engine still appeared to be hot. Suddenly, just as he saw Iraqis exiting the truck, the tank right next to his dispatched the Chevy and assumedly its former occupants, and then called an airstrike. No one could possibly have survived, he opined, and added that his platoon received orders not to speak of the incident. Hours later, during a press briefing that he described to Steve as hilarious, Army spokespeople denied making any incursions into Iraq or fighting shots at installations there. Later, though, McVeigh said he had been quite dismayed after the press conference because he, quote, hated to hear the Army lie, the soldiers or the public. Perhaps another reason for the fear evident in McVeigh's letters was the increasing number of reported friendly fire incidents appearing in the news reports. Although U.S. casualties during Operation Desert Storm were minuscule in comparison to previous wars, a large number of them resulted from friendly fire and anomalous accidents, information about which, complained journalists, was being withheld by the Pentagon. One such incident occurred on February 16th when a U.S. Apache helicopter fired 2 Hellfire anti-tank missiles and incinerated a Bradley, killing 2 and wounding 6 of the U.S. soldiers inside of it. As nearby troops began evacuating their own tanks and running for cover, the Apache continued a barrage of machine gun fire, as the Apache pilot announced on the radio, heard by all, "This bud's for you," killing an additional 6. Note: on January 30th, 1991, 11 U.S. Marines died after an American Maverick missile hit their personnel carrier. The Marines had been part of a forward reconnaissance patrol engaged in combat with Iraqi troops west of Kafji. Such events, said CENTCOM Chief of Staff, Major General Robert Johnson, were unfortunate but normal occurrences in war. A growing number of journalists alleged that during the daily Pentagon press briefings, the only sanctioned source of information for them, inaccurate or wholly falsified information was given to them. One example of this were the initial claims of military spokespeople that U.S. Marines had not played significant roles in the Kafji attacks. As journalists were not allowed there by the Pentagon, it was left to maverick reporters and photographers who had breached the Pentagon's policy and gone there independently. On February 2nd, another U.S. Marine was killed by bombs dropped by American planes, who had confused the U.S. convoy with an Iraqi one. On February 4th, 1991, that mechanical failures caused an American B-52 to crash over the Indian Ocean. 1 AH-1 Cobra and 1 UH-1 Marine Corps helicopters accidentally crashed over Saudi Arabia, killing the 6 passengers inside them. On February 26th, another friendly fire incident during Allied bombings killed 7 U.S. Army soldiers. Ultimately, during the entire ground war alone, cluster munitions and bomblets dropped from U.S. Air Force planes killed at least 14 U.S. troops and wounded an additional 100. The February 16th incident raised the number of U.S. friendly fire casualties to 10 out of every 14 deaths. End note. According to Stickney, McVeigh was horrified after hearing this on the radio, as his unit had been within 3 miles of the incident, but he told his biographers that he had only learned the true account of the incident months later. At the time, he said, they were informed that the Bradley had been the target of an unexpected attack by Iraqi hitmen, and said in that moment he thought, there is another reason to hate the Iraqi ragheads. In a letter to Steve on February 18th, 2 days after the incident, he declared that if Steve could see the multiple launch rocket system, his dick would get hard, and went on to discuss a friendly fire kill. He acknowledged to his attorneys that within the first few hours of the ground war, his platoon did receive friendly artillery fire that left him feeling extremely helpless, describing it as random death from above. On February 17, 1991, President Bush announced that Iraq's invasion of Kuwait would end very, very soon. Reportedly, the air war alone had resulted in approximately 100,000 Iraqi deaths. On February 22nd, as thousands of tanks and 250,000 U.S. troops sat poised on the Saudi-Iraq border, Bradley vehicles and Abrams tanks stretched for miles as Apache helicopters from the 101st Airborne flew overhead, shaking the earth and turning night into day in what was the largest helicopter invasion in history. The Apaches continually bombarded the Iraqi army, scattering them, as coalition ground troops pursued them, thinning out and annihilating Iraqi divisions in a desert orgy of violence. On Friday, February 21, 1991, Bush publicly warned that Iraq had 1 week to vacate Kuwait, and the next day, Iraqis reportedly set fire to an additional 950 Kuwaiti oil wells. The Ground War. On the evening of Saturday, February 23, 1991, networks interrupted regular television broadcasts to announce breaking news. The Persian Gulf Ground War, or Operation Desert Storm, had officially begun. George Bush Sr. declared, the liberation of Kuwait has entered the final phase, and Defense Secretary Dick Cheney issued a brownout, suspending media briefings for nearly 24 hours, citing the need to maintain operational security. For media consumers, the motives of the war were already clear. Evil Iraqis were rounding up, torturing, and executing Kuwaitis. The next day, on Sunday, February 24th, in what was called the most sweeping armored attack since World War II, over 200,000 Allied troops, including 150,000 U.S. soldiers, entered Iraq and Iraqi-occupied Kuwait. Schwarzkopf promised that the Iraqi army would be pursued vigorously. We're going to go around, over, through, on top, underneath, and any other way. We're going to pursue them in any way it takes to get them out of Kuwait. Schwarzkopf's Operation Desert Sabre called for a Hail Mary flank strategy that hinged upon the 7th Corps main effort, Task Force Iron, a crucial component of which was the 1st Mechanized Infantry Division. The objective, to cross into Kuwait, head northeast towards Kuwait City, and flank and cut off retreating Iraqi units along the way, clearing a passage through the desert for spearheading Marines approaching from the south. The Iraqi front line, Saddam's line in the sand, or line of death, was said to be fortified with deep minefields and oil-filled trenches intended to burst out into a deadly inferno. According to one commanding general of the task force, the strategy was to maintain a rapid tempo, thus not giving Iraqis time to react until it was too late and they were either dead or captured. Heavy aerial bombardment and the earlier interventions of Marines, paratrooper, psychological warfare, and Special Forces units had helped to soften the border and flush out Iraqi troops who, once the ground war started, began retreating south, only to be met with tanks and Bradley vehicles. According to one fighter-bomber squadron commander, the ensuing massive Iraqi retreat was inevitable, as their only other option was to attempt to hold their position and get killed in their holes. Despite these best-laid plans, military planners anticipated the high casualty rates in the breaching operation and predicted the decommissioning of the most forward-moving units for several days after the initial battle. Note: the air assault the evening before the ground war started was much less spectacular than was originally planned, as smoke from burning oil wells, now reported to cover over half of Kuwait, reduced visibility, leading to the cancellation of some sorties. In June 1995, weeks after his arrest, McVeigh gave the Jones team his first and perhaps only hour-by-hour detailed account of his experiences during the Gulf War. His recollections of events that occurred from February 23rd to February 26th tend to blend, as if for him it had been one long, strange, and terrifying day whose exact details are hard to know. He described the Gulf War to his father and sister as one long, somewhat boring drive in the desert. He claimed to his biographers that even as they approached the Iraqi front line, as he felt the ground trembling underneath him, he was still able to sleep, and, referring to the Ryder truck bomb used in Oklahoma, remarked that after this, sleeping on the back of a 7,000-pound bomb is no big deal. Prior to making these claims, though, he described to his attorney how, on the eve of the ground assault, while they were still about 10 miles outside the Iraqi border, he had experienced terror for the first time in his life. He awoke at 2:30 a.m. the next morning to find the desert shaking and rockets going off. His entire body began to shake from anxiety, and he confessed to more than one person that he did not think they would survive. In the first unofficial biography of Tim McVeigh, All-American monster Brandon Stickney wrote that, as McVeigh waited for the action to begin, he thought about his role until it scared him. McVeigh was in charge of a group that might not make it out alive. An article in the New York Times quoted a soldier with McVeigh who said, "The night before the war kicked off, McVeigh was saying how he was scared because we were going to be part of the first wave. He was scared we weren't going to come out of it. Maybe we would get shot, blown up. He was just concerned. I was feeling the same way, but most people didn't express it." Playboy also quoted the same soldier as saying, "We were in the desert, sleeping on the sand, and he really thought we were going to die. He was worried that we would be killed by our own helicopters or tanks." Other soldiers with him confirmed this, saying that McVeigh was afraid, but added that what he feared most was not enemy fire, but friendly fire from above, or even buried alive by U.S. tanks. Making matters worse, his commanding officer, Lieutenant Jesus Angel Rodriguez, by all accounts terrified himself, made the decision to transfer McVeigh into his Bradley, thereby separating him from the crew he had trained with for 3 years. The stated primary objective for forming the cohort units was the prevention of psychological breakdown in battle by building cohesion and trust among fellow soldiers. For McVeigh, who thrived on his training and regimentation, Lieutenant Rodriguez's decision must have seemed unthinkable and could not have calmed his already fraying nerves. Mark Ham wrote about the wild drives through the desert with McVeigh at the turret and Roger Barnett at the wheel, but Barnett himself and several other sources described a very different scenario. "We were the top gunning team. I was the top driver. McVeigh was the top gunner, and Sergeant Albert Warnement, he was the top Bradley commander. When we got to Saudi Arabia, we were on the same track, and then our lieutenant, he took McVeigh over to his track. But our lieutenant, he wasn't worth a crap." Note: this unexpected and inexplicable transfer away from his crew likely unnerved McVeigh greatly, as according to one fellow cohort in the Bradley crew McVeigh trained with, he was a smart and excellent soldier, but if he was faced with something he hadn't been trained in, he wouldn't react well. He was the type that needed to have practiced or been trained in a task. Indeed, a number of incidents involving Lieutenant Rodriguez compounded the fears and confusion of many others in the unit. The evening before the ground war, as they headed, balls to the wall, toward Safwan, McVeigh tried to catch some sleep in the moving Bradley, and, like the previous evening, found this difficult to do. He woke suddenly, only to find Rodriguez, who was supposed to be acting as lookout, asleep. At that exact moment, McVeigh spotted a landmine directly in front of them, which they were about to hit. He yelled at the driver, who swerved out of the way, waking Lieutenant Rodriguez up. They did appear accident-prone. During one particularly chaotic moment, Sergeant First Class Dutton stepped on a landmine. Sergeant Robinson remembered, We were sitting up at night, and they told Dutton to go out and check the bunkers just to make sure there were no Iraqis and destroy any equipment that was in there. Well, he blew himself up in the process with his own weapon. Lieutenant Rodriguez testified later that McVeigh saved Robinson from bleeding to death by disobeying Rodriguez's order to pull out the shrapnel. McVeigh, who had specialized medic training, feared the screaming Robinson was bleeding too profusely, and instead bandaged the wound and calmed him down. The Jones team later noted recurring themes throughout the stories McVeigh and other soldiers told them about their experiences in the Gulf. Several had described a deep lack of confidence in their commanders and comrades, which they attributed to inexperience, poor training, and leadership, and a general sense of being ill-equipped and ill-prepared for what they were facing. Many also recalled, however, that during this frightful experience, McVeigh's presence helped to calm them. Bad Company's driver said Sergeant McVeigh was the one you wanted in the foxhole with you. Alan Smith, also in McVeigh's Bradley, said he never felt safe when Tim left the vehicle, sometimes fearing his comrades might intentionally or accidentally shoot at him, and that out of the entire company he trusted McVeigh alone. Note: a former attorney on the Jones team, Randall Coyne, said, McVeigh was an exemplary soldier, obviously. There were a lot of Bronze Stars handed out during the Gulf War, but not as many with a V for valor like he had. I put a witness on during the sentencing trial who described Tim as being Iron Mike. Iron Mike is the statue they have when they go to basic training, I think, and he knew Tim to be like him, the exemplary statue of the model soldier. He's the guy you'd want with you if you were in combat. He's the guy watching your back. He's the guy who would not desert you. He's the guy who might sacrifice his life for yours. That was his impression of Tim as a soldier and a fellow military professional. McVeigh said he was under a tremendous amount of pressure and felt responsible for the men in his Bradley as well as those in the tanks directly behind him. People were going nuts. During one Scud attack alert, a man in the back of McVeigh's Bradley, sitting directly above the ammunition storage and unable to see outside, began crying, freaked out, and refused to take his gas mask off. At some point, a soldier pulled out a gun and demanded that unless he could talk to a major, he would kill himself. The major, in fear for his life, refused to talk to the soldier, so Sergeant McVeigh requested permission to stay and talk him down, a request the major denied. The high-tech turkey shoot. In the weeks prior to the start of the ground war, reports about Iraqi and coalition POWs regularly appeared in the news. In the final weeks of January 1991, U.S. military police had begun building facilities to house up to 20,000 Iraqi POWs and defectors. Meanwhile, coalition spokespeople accused Iraq of violating the Geneva Protocols in their treatment of Allied POWs. A number of international protocols existed establishing standards for the humane treatment of enemy and civilian POWs, not the least of which was the 1949 Geneva Convention. These protocols prohibited the torture, use of chemical weapons, and the killing of both enemy and civilian prisoners, as well as exposing them to live fire in combat zones. Note: in December 1990, the U.S. Navy's ship Comfort has been designated specifically for Iraqis captured during the Commando oil platform raids. Later, Iraqis paraded British pilots they had captured through the streets of Baghdad. The photos of captured Allied troops released by Iraq became a subject of debate within the American media. ABC chose to show the pictures but not broadcast the audio, fearing it would add to the effectiveness of Iraqi propaganda efforts. CNN, NBC, and CBS aired the photos as well as audio of 9 U.S. POWs denouncing the aggressive actions of America against Iraq. The Allied prisoners had been placed in highly targeted areas to act as human shields, and Iraq claimed civilian facilities continued to be targeted. Article 23 of the Geneva Convention dictated, "No prisoner may at any time be sent to or detained in areas where he may be exposed to the fire of the combat zone, nor may his presence be used to render certain points or areas immune from military operations." Iraq claimed, however, that as long as the U.S. continued to violate the Geneva Convention in their treatment of Iraqi and Palestinian POWs, so too would they. McVeigh admitted that he was terrified even before leaving the neutral zone and crossing into Iraq, and had decided that if he was going to die, he would kill as many Iraqis as he could. In a letter written to Steve, dated February 23, 1991, day one of the ground war, he complained that Geneva Convention rules regulating the treatment of POWs would end up getting everybody killed. Therefore, he wrote, "I've made up my mind, no prisoners. It may be on my conscience for years, and I may be accused of killing defenseless people, but when push comes to shove, and my life, along with the lives of everyone in my vehicle, is on the line, you gotta do what you gotta do." Note: interestingly, Dr. John R. Smith, widely cited for finding McVeigh sane, was an expert in POW conditions, and his teacher, Dr. Jolly West, the leading U.S. expert on the topic, came to appear within several experimental wolf narratives about the bombing in McVeigh. The record shows that the Jones team called West because McVeigh's conditions of confinement had led to his mental and physical deterioration, and for this reason, among others, Dr. Smith treated McVeigh regularly while he awaited trial. On February 24th, while still in the neutral zone between Iraq and Saudi Arabia, Task Force Iron finally met with the Iraqi army. Rules of engagement dictated enemy troops be given the chance to surrender rather than be killed. Although the news brownout complicated attempts to construct an accurate picture of the early hours of the ground war, news outlets nonetheless described disheveled and disarmed Iraqi prisoners shambling single file across the desert with smoky oil fires smudging the skies of eastern Kuwait. From the Washington Post, February 25, 1991. On February 24th, an estimated 8,400 U.S. soldiers and 3,000 Abrams tanks, Bradleys, and other personnel carriers from the 1st Infantry Division came up against a reported 8,000 Iraqi soldiers on Basra Highway. Indeed, the Iraqis encountered by Allied forces were not wild-eyed, rag-headed terrorists, torturers, and murderers. Rather, many had open sores, appeared covered in lice, and were starving, demoralized, poorly trained, inadequately armed, or completely unarmed, and in the process of deserting or surrendering. According to reports, very often the elite Iraqi Republican Guard units stood behind Iraqi soldiers confined to holes in trenches in order to prevent them from deserting. The commander of one U.S. field hospital said the Iraqi POWs were terrified of airplanes, sometimes curling up into fetal positions upon hearing them, while others suffered from acute shell shock or combat stress. Some news outlets reported that Iraqi soldiers were extremely happy upon their capture. Many commanders felt overwhelmed by their inability to care for the thousands of Iraqi POWs and feared their presence would disrupt or impede the advance. According to McVeigh, it was on the first day of the ground war, heading north towards Safwan, that he first encountered surrendering Iraqis in a trench. After he fired at the trench, what seemed like thousands of Iraqis emerged waving white surrender flags. The voluntary POWs caused an extraordinary amount of tension, as U.S. troops didn't know what to do with them, and there were an insufficient number of interpreters to make sense of it all. On this occasion, he said, feeling overwhelmed, U.S. soldiers ordered the Iraqis to the rear, and to keep walking, you stupid fucking Iraqis, we don't have time to deal with hostages right now. McVeigh told the Jones team that when he first witnessed the surrendering Iraqis, looking up at the huge guns pointed at them, he began to realize the gap between what the army had taught him about war and the reality of war, as well as the people who fight them. For the first time, he felt sympathy for those he was supposed to kill. The Iraqis were not evil, as the media and military told him. They were pathetic, scared, hungry, and confused. His encounters with them were so visceral, he could literally smell from a mile away our guys who had patted down the surrendering Iraqis. After the initial aerial assaults, the conflict had basically become a war with civilians with guns. As soon as the Americans came upon the Iraqis, they surrendered. The narratives of other men with him in the Gulf echo McVeigh's, who said the army had not properly trained them to face the enemy they found in Iraq. One cohort, Royal Witcher, said that of all his experiences in the Gulf, the hardest to deal with were the surrendering Iraqis. Ray Barnes described the scene. That first day when it went from Desert Shield to Desert Storm, as we were making our way to and across the border, all of a sudden there was an exodus. It was just like 5,000 people. They were walking to surrender. They were giving up. I don't think any of them had a gun with them. Well, yes, some of them had guns, but then they didn't have ammo, or they just had blanks. They were so hungry and dehydrated. They were offering stacks of money to the officers for a bottle of water, offering bricks of hash for water because there it's legal to smoke hash. Can't drink whiskey, but can smoke hash. After comparing all the stories told to them by McVeigh's fellow soldiers, the Jones team found that their interactions with Iraqis, particularly those killed later, had left a profound mark on all those interviewed. One memo observed, they did not encounter the enemy which they expected, an enemy they could keep at arm's length, but rather saw the humanity and frailty of the people they were required to kill. In June 1995, weeks after his arrest, McVeigh told members of his legal team that this newfound feeling of sympathy for the Iraqis made what happened later a lot worse. What happened later depends upon whom you ask, when you ask, and sometimes why you ask it. After the Oklahoma bombing, news reports described McVeigh firing upon and killing Iraqi soldiers that had been attempting to surrender, an act said to foreshadow and illustrate his later ability to kill without remorse. McVeigh described to his attorneys how, as they had breached the Iraqi front lines, 4 Bradleys, including his own, lined up in front of an entrenched Iraqi machine gun bunker. He then fired at the trench from 1,600 meters away, and with one shot hit his target and observed a red cloud emanate from it. After he fired several more rounds, everyone in the trenches surrendered, but just at that moment he observed to his right members of Bravo Company shooting at the surrendering Iraqis, and at that point tried to get Lieutenant Rodriguez to radio over and tell them to stop. He said that only later did he learn that he killed 2 Iraqi soldiers with the 1,600-meter shot. He described the incident a bit differently to his biographers a few years later. He said that as they approached a dug-in enemy machine gun nest, still over a mile away, Lieutenant Rodriguez ordered him to fire. He instantly saw a flash of light, assumed it was enemy fire, and, with the Bradley still moving, began to adjust his sights. As he did so, an Iraqi soldier popped his head up for a split second. McVeigh fired at him, and the man's upper body exploded. His head just disappeared, like in a red mist. The shot, he said, also killed another Iraqi soldier standing nearby. Lieutenant Rodriguez ordered him to keep firing, but McVeigh hesitated because he noticed that the rest of the dug-in Iraqis had begun to surrender. But since Lieutenant Rodriguez started screaming at him, he just fired off a few more rounds far off into the desert to appease him. For this, he earned an Army Commendation Medal, and on the accompanying certificate, his commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Moreno, noted that McVeigh had inspired others in his company by destroying an enemy machine gun encampment, killing 2 Iraqi soldiers, and forcing 30 others to surrender. The incident is one of the few where the accounts of the cohort unit differ. Corroborating this story were the accounts of William Dilley and his commanding officer, First Sergeant Harris. Dilley: Tim shot an Iraqi soldier that he saw. We gave him so much time to give up, and then we couldn't wait, so we had to clear the trenches so we'd go down and put rounds in them. We couldn't leave them and couldn't go by them, so we cleared the trenches. Tim saw one of the guys he shot, and the lieutenant saw it too. I know he did, because he said Tim had a confirmed kill. They saw the guy stand up, and Tim hit him, literally, which was a pretty decent shot, you know? That was the only reason Tim talked about it later. He was just there to do his job and was serious about the Army. Harris: Tim did well in the Gulf. We all did. We went into the battle expecting significant American losses, up to 70%, going up against the 4th largest army in the world, and so there was a great deal of fear and anxiety when we first crossed the Iraqi lines, but there was little resistance. A few would pop up from their trenches and fire at us, and some of those Iraqis got killed as a result. It really couldn't be helped. However, according to others, it was McVeigh, not Bravo Company, who had continued to fire at the unarmed POWs. One man told the FBI that McVeigh had bragged on numerous occasions about an Iraqi soldier he'd killed while in Desert Storm, telling the story of how he'd killed a fucking raghead. Lester Robinson also described an Iraqi man with an AK-47 who seemed to appear out of nowhere and started firing at them. Since Lieutenant Rodriguez was unavailable at the time, McVeigh, feeling that the AK-wielding Iraqi posed a threat, took the initiative and naturally shot him, accidentally killing an unarmed man holding a white surrender flag standing close by. James Spencer concurred that McVeigh made the shot, but said the continued fire afterwards came from a different gunner on the tank Spencer himself was in, but did so only after their commander, not Rodriguez, directly ordered them to open fire on surrendering Iraqis. The commander who issued the order, Spencer added apologetically, felt bad about it later. Ray Barnes offered his recollections. A lot of things that people said about him, like him supposedly snipering somebody with a .25 Mac at 1,000 yards, I never heard him talk about that. But did he do it? No. After the bombing, the FBI came and hauled me in and questioned me, and the CID came and paid me a visit and picked me up. Hauled me in. They were supposedly investigating possible war crimes with that 1,000-yard headshot. According to the Geneva Convention, that's overkill. That's one of my main gripes. What we're dealing with now with the terrorists. It's a reason a lot of our boys are dying, because we're playing by the rules and the other team isn't. Garrett Bessler, positioned in the tank directly next to McVeigh at the time, said he heard about the allegations but insisted they were absolutely false, emphasizing, Tim wasn't the type to be trying to get that first kill no matter what the cost. He did recall a related incident at an unknown time that caused McVeigh to lose his temper. Bessler said that, once, Alpha and Bravo Company Bradleys were firing at a particular target for over 2 hours before it dawned on them that they had sufficiently destroyed it. As soon as they stopped, groups of Iraqis holding their rifles upside down with sheets tied to them appeared. But Bravo opened fire on the Iraqis, some of them went down, then others stood back up and the Bradleys opened fire again. Bessler was not sure how many they killed or even which specific Bradley vehicles fired, but said that later, Army officials conducted an investigation into the incident and Bravo's role in it. After returning from the Gulf, Bessler recounted the incident in sworn testimony and even confronted Lieutenant Rodriguez, who denied that he saw it, a claim Bessler thought impossible. Nevertheless, Bessler believed the people responsible for the deaths had been busted and discharged from the Army. While speculative, I offer the possibility that perhaps among the reasons the soldiers' records later went missing were incidents such as this. McVeigh's friend and fellow cohort, Gordon Blackcloud, recalled the chaotic killing during their combat. I was a Bradley driver for the first half of the war and then a gunner. Everybody more or less fired on everybody. We took a lot of prisoners. I know we killed some of them Iraqis. Everybody had to. My platoon sergeant got hit, and then I got hit in the back, and then the back of the head. Another guy blew off his foot by stepping on a mine. After I got hit, we ran over there to our platoon sergeant and wrapped him up because we were also combat medics. My whole back was bleeding and everything, but I didn't let them take me off until we got done with our platoon sergeant. In unpublished letters and conversations with his biographers, McVeigh elaborated about the time I shot that guy in the Gulf, describing it as a pivotal and meaningful experience. This is the point when I felt empathy for the enemy. I understood that these were just people too. I'm not a coward. Anybody who knows me knows that. I learned in the Gulf and through the news that people are the same. It doesn't matter why you kill a person, you're still killing humans. How did I feel about killing those soldiers? At the time, it was instinctive, no feelings. You turn off your feelings until after you have time to deal with them. It's like a computer. You put them in memory and access them later. There was a lot of activity immediately after that. A lot of things were happening. In the end, I can accept the fact that I did kill those Iraqis, and I think that in my heart, maybe it would have been wrong, but that's life in the 20th century. Humans kill humans. I don't kill for pleasure, and I don't kill for personal gain. General Schwarzkopf heralded the initial assault as a dramatic success. Coalition troops encountered minimal resistance as they entered Iraq and Iraqi-occupied Kuwait, capturing thousands of POWs along the way. Although the U.S. refused to release casualty information, 7 U.S. Marines died as they passed through the Saudi village of Khafji. Still, said Schwarzkopf, this was a remarkably light number of casualties, and he was delighted with the progress. Defense Secretary Dick Cheney told television viewers, "We have no interest in occupying Iraq, but there won't be any sanctuary inside Iraq for those forces who've been involved in occupying Kuwait." News reports later detailed how the majority of Iraqis simply did not want to fight and were killed as they vacated the vehicles and trenches they inhabited, waving white flags. John Simpson wrote that the battles of the Gulf War were not like those of World War II, but instead merely the slaughter of tens of thousands of Third World soldiers armed only with weapons incapable of penetrating American armor. Almost every Iraqi soldier would have willingly given himself up if he had been given the chance. Even the punishment squads, which were based behind the Iraqi lines to shoot deserters, had little interest in obeying their orders. Many of them planned to desert themselves. The unnecessary slaughter of thousands of Iraqis came to be called by those who had been there, including McVeigh, a high-tech turkey shoot. McVeigh also said that what came later was much worse, but did not elaborate. The bulldozer assault. Quote, "I wish to use the words of Justice Brandeis dissenting in Olmsted to speak for me. He wrote, 'Our government is the potent, the omnipresent teacher. For good or ill, it teaches the whole people by its example.'" Timothy James McVeigh at his sentencing hearing, August 4, 1997. On February 25, 1991, 15 hours ahead of schedule, McVeigh's division had crossed into southern Iraq and completed what General Schwarzkopf called a classic breaching that would be studied for years. McVeigh's Bradley was in the lead, moving parallel to Iraqi trenches along the Iraq-Saudi border until they shifted northward and continued for 300 miles. For over 100 hours, the Big Red One engaged the Iraqi army in an awesome display of death that would have shaken the most steadfast soldier and took thousands of prisoners in the process. During the initial entry into Iraq, McVeigh's Bradley stopped briefly. The radio operator, having seen what appeared to be a large number of troops approaching, attempted to make contact with them in order to determine if they were friendlies. Just at that moment, the radio malfunctioned, and although the sights were not properly set on the Bradley's 25mm, Lieutenant Rodriguez ordered them to drive out and investigate. Upon doing so, British troops who were cleaning out mines informed them that they had just driven into a minefield. McVeigh said that Lieutenant Rodriguez almost plowed the Brits over. Although they didn't, the incident foreshadowed what was to happen soon after. In his strikingly insensitive 1994 account of the Gulf War, entitled Iron Soldiers, How America's 1st Armored Division Crushed Iraq's Elite Republican Guard, military historian Tom Carhart provided a highly sanitized, feel-good version of Desert Storm, one that, it is safe to assume, passed Pentagon and military muster. Among the many stories Carhart recounted was one relayed to him by a female MP from the 337 Armored McVeigh's Battalion. The MP was tasked with finding the few hundred Iraqi POWs the 337th had thus far captured. She said that while she minded the POWs, an Army engineering vehicle had scooped out a trench about 12 feet wide and 6 feet deep with wire around it. As she tried to herd the POWs into the trench, she observed that many of the prisoners were literally in tears, grown men groveling on their knees with uplifted hands, pleading for their lives. She then realized with a little shock that they believed the Americans were about to bury them, as Iraqi leaders had prophesied. Because there were no translators available to the MP, she gathered up candy, which they had in abundance, and MREs, and saw to it that each POW had handfuls of the food. After they received their candy, the POWs became confusedly silent, asking themselves, why would the Yankee devil feed us candy if he was going to bury us? Until eventually they realized they were in no danger, and all of the Iraqis' fears vanished. From February 24th to 25th, a nightmarish scene occurred that Ramsey Clark described as the most horrifying story of all. This story exposed a war very different from Carhart's or the one Americans saw in the nightly news. It was first reported on September 12, 1991, and was picked up by several news outlets whose shocking headlines declared that U.S. Army buried Iraqi soldiers alive in Gulf War. The incident, or series of incidents, occurred near the Saudi-Iraqi border as the 1st Mechanized Infantry Division, in their breaching effort, tore through over 70 miles of barbed wire, minefields, bunkers, and trenches about 3 feet wide and 6 feet deep, defended by, according to division estimates, 8,000 Iraqi soldiers. After howitzers and rocket launchers rained hell upon Iraqis in their trenches, the heavily armored Abrams and Bradley vehicles broke through, and the real slaughter began. During what came to be known as the bulldozer assault, Abrams tanks outfitted with plows and scrapers broached the trenches, shoveling mounds of sand into them, burying alive the Iraqis inside. Vulcan armored carriers and Bradley vehicles drove alongside the trenches, firing upon those attempting to surrender and others who continued to return fire with small arms. The armored combat earth movers cleaned up the horrifying scene afterwards by burying the scattered arms and legs still in view, so that none of the journalists arriving 36 hours later could report carnage. The record shows that as early as June 5, 1995, weeks after McVeigh's arrest, the Jones team was aware of the bulldozer assault and had noted their need to determine whether any member of his platoon actually ran over Iraqi trenches burying soldiers in them, or if they had seen evidence of this as they approached the trenches. If any of his fellow soldiers spoke to the defense team about it, no such documentation was located in the Jones collection. However, upon closer inspection, it becomes clear that McVeigh's company, his Bradley among them, spearheaded the breaching operation and led the bulldozer assault. In the few reports about it, news outlets quoted at least two individuals whom McVeigh knew. In September 1991, one of them, Colonel Anthony Moreno, who commanded the 1st Mechanized Lead Brigade against the most heavily defended trenches during the assault, described it, telling reporters, "What you saw was a bunch of buried trenches with people's arms and legs sticking out of them. For all I know, we could have killed thousands. As Iraqi soldiers saw what we were doing and how effectively we were doing it, they began jumping out of their holes and surrendering. Our firepower kept the Iraqis down in their trenches. They were incapable of firing back." No existing biography of McVeigh explores the horror of the bulldozer assault in any depth, or even mentions it as such. In his book, Stickney simply wrote, "A lot of shooting by the Americans was directed at the enemy's dug-in trenches." Ham acknowledged that McVeigh's platoon was assigned to roll up the trenches and nearby artillery bunkers surrounding them. This involved rolling over them in Bradleys, tanks, trucks, and giant earth movers, suffocating to death hundreds of Iraqi troops in the trenches. This tactic not only effectively killed the enemy, but the huge pile of corpses provided a sturdy foundation for a smooth crossing point for the invading forces. Herbeck and Michel did not directly address the bulldozer assault, the bodies buried alive, or McVeigh's role in it. Rather, they allude to it obliquely by observing that the motto of the 7th Corps was, "If it's in front of us, it dies," and, because of the sounds made by the tanks rolling over Iraqis, U.S. soldiers began to refer to the dead they'd created as crunchies. The handful of existing news reports about the incident provide further details. Participants later said that they had carefully planned and rehearsed the bulldozer assault weeks before it commenced, a claim confirmed by satellite photographs. One captain described the psychological trauma he later suffered because of his role in the slaughter. The Iraqis, he said, had been throwing down their weapons and were begging the U.S. troops to take them prisoner. "I wish we could have," he reflected. "But after taking so many thousands of prisoners, the order came down that it was endangering our men to capture any more, so we called in the bulldozers. I had to give the order men who drove the earth movers to just cover up the trenches. I buried hundreds of men alive. If I'd disobeyed orders, I should have been shot for insubordination on the battlefield. That's war." Others also provided vivid descriptions. Captain Bernie Williams said, "There were times when we knew they were in a bunker, and we gave them a chance to give up. I'd tell my guns to fire off to the side and give them a chance. I would say about 60% of the guys gave up, and there were some who decided to gut it out. A lot of guys were buried in bunkers, I'm sure. We just drove over them or backed into them to make the walls collapse. Once we went through there, other than the ones who surrendered, there wasn't anybody left." Sergeant Joe Queen, who received a Bronze Star for his role in the attack, said, "We were traveling at 5 to 7 miles an hour just moving along the trench. You don't see the Iraqis. You're up there in the half-hatch, and you know what you gotta do. You did it as much as you could close your eyes and do it. I don't think they had any idea, because the look on their faces as we came through the berm was just a look of shock. I feel sorry for them that stayed in the trenches, but they did what they did for their country just like we would. The military furnished us with this piece of equipment, and that's what it's designed to do." An unnamed Iraqi soldier who survived the attack said, "Some of the soldiers were walking towards the U.S. troops holding their arms up to surrender, and the tanks moved in and killed them. They dug a hole in the ground, and then they buried the soldiers and leveled it. I really don't know how to describe. It was horrible to witness. I saw one soldier and his body was just torn apart by a bulldozer. The upper part was on one side and the lower on the other side." Many journalists said they had been tightly controlled and intentionally kept back from the bulldozed areas. One report observed, "It was a battlefield without the stench of urine, feces, and bits of flesh. The dead had eluded eyewitnesses, cameras, and video footage." A war correspondent for The Guardian said that when he arrived at the scene, there were no bodies anywhere. When he asked a public affairs officer from the First where the bodies had gone, the official replied, "What bodies?" Simpson wrote, "There was an intensive effort to make sure that the scale of Iraqi losses was hidden from the world. When the Pentagon finally allowed journalists on the site, there were no bodies, no barbed wire, not even the trenches. It was too ugly for the public to be told about, and for that reason, it had been all thoroughly tidied away." Although the House and Senate Armed Services Committees claimed the Pentagon withheld details about the bulldozer assault in their final report on the Gulf War, it was justified as a legitimate tactical maneuver in a number of ways by those who planned and led it. In Dick Cheney's 2002 report to Congress that attempted to justify the assault, he wrote, "Because of the uncertainties and the need to minimize loss of U.S. lives, Military necessity required that the assault be conducted with maximum speed and violence. Other military planners claimed that if an opportunity for the Iraqis to surrender had been announced over loudspeakers, U.S. soldiers would have had to exit their armored vehicles and engage the Iraqis in hand-to-hand combat, or could even have become the targets of a chemical attack. Others said that while they had given the Iraqis a chance to surrender, the Iraqis declined the offer. When asked to estimate the total number buried, Department of Defense spokesperson Pete Williams denied the Army had intended to bury anyone alive, but then continued, remarking that, "War is hell. I would certainly say many were buried. I don't mean to be flippant, but there is no nice way to kill somebody in a war. There is no provision in the Geneva Convention that would prohibit this operation. The Iraqi soldiers that were killed in this process were those who chose to stay in their trenches or behind obstacles and fight during the breaching operation." The motto of Fort Riley's 1st Mechanized Infantry Division, the Big Red One, claims, "No mission too difficult, no sacrifice too great, duty first." Shortly after the bulldozer incident, Major General Thomas Rames, the commander of the entire 1st Division, declared to journalists, "I didn't come over here to fight fair. Rather, he came to fight, win, and save American lives." A goal Rames achieved by burying what he claimed were 400 Iraqis during the frontline breach. When reporters questioned Army officials about the incident during a press conference at Fort Riley, where McVeigh was stationed before and after the Gulf War, officials there said that the bulldozing method had saved American lives as the Iraqi barrier posed the biggest threat to U.S. troops. Rames said, "All I can tell you is that there were little hands and arms sticking up out of the dirt. They chose not to surrender, they chose to fight, so we buried them." Lieutenant Colonel Stephen Hawkins, who helped plan the assault, said the point was to terrorize the Iraqis into surrendering and thought it had worked. "It caused an instant hands up in many places," remarked Hawkins. Note, a U.S. Marine Corps officer involved in the 7th Corps bulldozer assault told the Washington Post that the bulldozer tactic was getting a bad reputation in the media. As officers involved in ground combat, our primary concern is mission accomplishment. Next on our list, and it is a very close second, is our fervent desire to bring all of our Marines and soldiers home alive. By contrast, preserving the life of the enemy who is trying to stop us from reaching our goals by killing us is quite low on our list of priorities. If the enemy chooses to surrender, he will be treated with as much care as we can possibly give him. If he chooses instead to fight, he must be destroyed." End quote. When asked if this was the standard operating procedure for the U.S. Army, Colonel Moreno said, "This was not doctrine. My concept is to defeat the enemy with your power and equipment. We're going to bludgeon them with every piece of equipment we've got. I'm not going to sacrifice the lives of my soldiers. That's not cost effective." Colonel Lon Maggart, an officer from Fort Riley whom McVeigh knew, said, "I know burying people like that sounds pretty nasty, but it would be even nastier if we had to put our troops in trenches and clean them out with bayonets." Note, although the U.S. claimed no American casualties resulted from the bulldozer assault, Pentagon officials later released a belated statement saying that 1 U.S. soldier was killed and 1 wounded during the breaching maneuver. End note. In fact, Moreno and Maggart, both of whom McVeigh knew, were among the first to talk to reporters about the attack. Both said that they intentionally used the bulldozer tactic to minimize American casualties, although in reality those inside the tanks and Bradleys were likely in no danger from the small arms fire coming from the trenches. The entire ordeal, at least for their brigades, lasted about 17 minutes. The Army later condemned and punished Moreno, who nominated McVeigh for several awards and decorations for his performance during combat in the Gulf, for providing this information to reporters. No one can really say exactly how many Iraqi soldiers were buried alive or how many had attempted to surrender before meeting their deaths. Newsday and The Guardian cited military officials who claimed 2,000 Iraqis actually surrendered. Other sources put the number at between 11,000 and 20,000. An Iraqi soldier said he thought Americans had buried perhaps 300 of his comrades, while Iraqi military spokespeople claimed the number was between 1 and 2,000. Some U.S. infantry personnel told reporters they had no idea how many people they buried under the sand. Rames said 400. Dick Cheney withheld details about it to a congressional report on the war, but did state that the Army buried 457 Iraqis in the sand. Maggart estimated that his brigade buried 650. A military source, quoted in the Jerusalem Post, said 6,000. Schwarzkopf's staff gave estimates of between 50,000 and 75,000 for the total number killed in trenches. It was hard to obtain an accurate body count given the literal cover-up that, according to the Pentagon, claimed no American casualties. Note: Cheney's 2002 report to Congress attempted to justify the bulldozer assault. In it, he wrote, "Because of these uncertainties and the need to minimize loss of U.S. lives, military necessity required that the assault be conducted with maximum speed and violence. There is a gap in the law of war in defining precisely when surrender takes effect or how it may be accomplished. An attempt to surrender in the midst of a hard-fought battle is neither easily communicated nor received." A classified log created by division officers reported that 150 had been buried and 500 taken prisoner. Other estimates for the number of prisoners taken that day are as high as 2,000, and lower estimates of the numbers buried ranged from 44 to 80 to a couple of hundred to 650. Pentagon sources were quoted as saying 457 Iraqis were buried dead in 56 temporary burial sites during the war, and the sites had been marked and reported to the Red Cross. Another report claimed the Iraqi government found 44 bodies. After claiming no U.S. soldiers had been killed, the Pentagon released a statement saying 1 U.S. soldier was killed and 1 wounded during the bulldozer maneuver. End note. While Geneva Convention protocols dictate that surrendering enemy troops be taken prisoner and not killed, the numbers of surrendering Iraqis would have been much higher had they not been summarily executed when attempting to do so. Many received medals for participating in the gory scene. The aerial assaults that had occurred since January 16th at the barrier where the bulldozer attack took place were equally horrifying. One report on January 25th said that much of the Iraqi artillery was destroyed by aerial napalm and fuel air bombings, which consisted of over 11,000 pounds of high explosives dropped 30 minutes before the bulldozer assault began. Still, they claimed, U.S. soldiers continued to face a formidable foe, and therefore had to ignite oil in some defensive trenches, among other methods. According to an FOIA request, the U.S. Marines confirmed they had dropped 489 napalm bombs on those poor fuckers in the trenches. The aerial and ground images of the aftermath in Basra, one military historian wrote, ranks up there with the young Vietnamese girl running naked from a napalm attack or the Zapruder film. This was the first, but by no means the last time, that McVeigh found himself at the center of a contentious moment in U.S. history. The Path to Hell is Paved, or Basra Highway. The Word of God, much bandied by George Bush, whose word illuminated midnight sky and confused the Baghdad cock who was betrayed by bombs into believing day was dawning, and crowed his heart out at the deadly raid, and didn't live to greet the proper morning. Now, with noonday headlights in Kuwait and the burial of the blackened in Baghdad, let them remember, all who celebrate, that their good news is someone else's bad, or the light will never dawn on poor mankind. From Tony Harrison, A Cold Coming, Gulf War Poems, 1991. The turkey shoot was not yet over. McVeigh said that, after destroying the Iraqi bunkers and trenches, his division received orders to head north as quickly as possible to an airfield in the city of Safwan, Iraq. Thus, throughout February 25th and 26th, 1991, the third and fourth days of the ground war, they pushed forward, balls to the wall, day and night, toward Safwan. As they headed toward Safwan, they encountered a massive sandstorm, a world-class biblical thunderstorm, and crossed paths with the Iraqi Republican Guard, whom they engaged in 2 famed battles. Commentators described the second, the Battle of Norfolk, which occurred in the Saudi village of Khafji, as the most costly and thus the most important battle of the war. McVeigh's division suffered the most extensive casualties, with 40 wounded and 7 dead. At first, Pentagon officials told reporters as well as the families of the dead that enemy fire had killed them, but months later, officials admitted that all the U.S. deaths resulted from friendly fire, mainly from American silver bullets, sabot rounds coated in depleted uranium. Note: after the war's end, it would later surface that, on February 27th, the deaths of the Marines and 9 British soldiers, the wounding of 40 more, and the destruction of 5 Abrams and 5 Bradleys during the Battle of Norfolk had all been the result of friendly fire. When the body of Sergeant Tony Applegate, killed during Norfolk, returned home, despite the letter signed by Major General Thomas Rain, commander of the 1st Mechanized Infantry Division, explaining he was killed as a result of enemy action, his widow became suspicious. Mrs. Applegate said, "The coffin didn't weigh anything. I wondered if Tony was really in there." The only portion of his body in the casket turned out to be a charred hip bone. Her husband was the gunner on an M1A1 Abrams tank that another Abrams hit with a sabot round, or silver bullet, that travels around a mile per second, its tip coated with dense depleted uranium. The sabot ignited a fire in Applegate's tank that burned for 2 days. Army officials thought his body had been sucked through a 3-inch vacuum created by the round. 21-year-old specialist Tony Kidd also died from an American silver bullet during Norfolk. Initially, military officials told the families that their loved ones had simply been killed in action, but when in August 1992 the Pentagon admitted they had died from friendly fire, they acknowledged they had hidden the truth to permit exhaustive investigations into each death. Lieutenant Colonel John Brown, the commander of the brigade who inflicted and received the highest number of friendly fire casualties during the Battle of Norfolk, explained such fratricide as the dark side of war. After Norfolk, McVeigh's company continued toward Safwan, traveling on Highway 8, a road that eventually connected with Highway 80, or Basra Highway, a 6-lane highway that connected Kuwait City to deep inside of Iraq, its center of gravity. By this time, the Iraqi army was in full retreat, with untold thousands of Iraqi soldiers and civilians in tanks, cars, school buses, ambulances, and on foot, heading north on Basra Highway and nearby Highway 8. Throughout February 26 and 27, the retreating Iraqis on both roads met with wave after wave of extensive aerial bombardment consisting of laser-guided missiles, mortars, cluster bombs, and machine gun fire from Apache and Cobra helicopters, Warthog and Thunderbolt fighter jets, and other U.S. aircraft equipped with infrared optics. A U.S. pilot described the scene as the biggest 4th of July show you've ever seen. Another said, "I just didn't envision going up there and shooting the hell out of everything in the dark and have them not know what the hell hit them. A truck blows up to the right, the ground blows up to the left. They had no idea where we were or what was hitting them. It looked like somebody had opened the sheep pen." U.S. ground troops aggressively pursued and killed those who managed to avoid the air assault. Footage recorded from an Apache helicopter revealed terrified Iraqi infantrymen shot to pieces, some were blown to bits, and others fled their bunkers under a firestorm. An Iraqi survivor of the attack said, "There were hundreds of cars destroyed, soldiers screaming. It was a nightmare as bombs fell, lighting charred cars, bodies on the side of the road, and soldiers sprawled on the ground, hit by cluster bombs as they tried escaping from their vehicles. I saw hundreds of soldiers like this." Reporters on the ground described seeing over 60 miles of burning oil wells, debris, and burning wreckage from thousands of abandoned and bombed military and civilian vehicles, as well as the gruesome sights of wild dogs feasting on mutilated Iraqi corpses that numbered from the hundreds to thousands. One described scores of soldiers in and around the vehicles, mangled and bloated in the drifting desert sands, the vehicles strafed, smashed, and burned beyond belief. Robert Fisk said he lost count of the Iraqi corpses crammed into the smoldering wreckage or clumped face down in the sand. Note: estimated numbers of retreating Iraqi soldiers and civilians ranged from 10,000 to 80,000, and the number of Iraqi vehicles on Basra Highway was estimated at approximately 2,000. Kuwaitis living in the area said many Iraqis attempted to flee, but those who escaped the aerial assault became the targets of coalition ground forces. Speaking of a quarter-mile traffic jam that trapped several hundred retreating vehicles, a U.S. officer told Press Association UK reporter Gordon Ayres, "We have taken out about 80 bodies from this tangled mess so far, but God knows how many are still in there." Ayres described his impressions of the scene, writing, "The few who managed to get north of the bottleneck trap did not last long either. All along the highway lay wrecked and burned out military vehicles and civilian cars, most of which had been abandoned during the attacks, with even more bodies lying alongside the road." Although the official body count ranged from 200 to 300 to several thousand, nobody could be sure how many Iraqis died on Basra Highway and on nearby Highway 8. While some reporters observed the bodies, the majority of corpses on Basra Highway simply disappeared. Coalition troops buried, dug up, reburied, and set ablaze those corpses not eaten by dogs. The Boston Globe reported, "Mile after wreckage-jammed mile of highway appeared as if frozen in mid-battle, and all along the way Allied soldiers worked, burying hundreds of dead in shallow graves." An aerial photo revealed Iraqis being dumped in a group grave by means of a front loader, a scoop fixed to a truck. The aerial footage released by the Pentagon, however, showed shreds of Iraq vehicles and equipment and no bodies. It was as if the desert were a sandbox and all the children had run away, leaving their toys behind. General Schwarzkopf said he ordered the attack for two reasons. First, he wanted to destroy Iraqi equipment, and second, the retreating Iraqis were a bunch of rapists, murderers, and thugs who had raped and pillaged downtown Kuwait City and were now trying to escape. The slaughter on and around Basra Highway was so utterly incomprehensible that to this day it is called the Highway of Death. Even warhawks described the ensuing mother of all defeats as one of the grisliest scenes of the war. The world learned about the massacre through the reports of journalists who arrived shortly after, and some credited their graphic descriptions with catalyzing George Bush's February 28, 1991 ceasefire declaration. The declared objective of the coalition's military intervention had been to force the Iraqi army out of Kuwait, which ultimately was exactly what occurred. Ham wrote that it was on the Highway of Death where McVeigh witnessed one of the greatest massacres of modern warfare, the slaughter of thousands of retreating Iraqi soldiers and civilians on the Basra Road, and quoted his CO, Captain Terry Guild, who said they wandered for miles through hundreds of blackened bodies. His official biography dedicates less than one paragraph to details of the gruesome sights they witnessed on their trek to Safwan. Quote, "McVeigh saw unspeakable carnage, hideously charred bodies, some of them with their heads or limbs blown off. Some were bloated to the size of cows as they rotted in the sun, horribly wounded enemy soldiers, some of them without arms or legs, trying to crawl along the sand, and stray dogs chewing on severed body parts. At one point, members of McVeigh's unit were told to help bury the Iraqi dead in the sand. Later, without explanation, they were told to stop the burials and leave the bodies out where they could be seen." At his criminal trial, Lieutenant Rodriguez testified that McVeigh had taken pictures of the dead Iraqis. McVeigh denied this, claiming that it was the driver of his Bradley, not him, who had done that. Neither his biographers nor the Jones team would see any of the rolls of pictures he took during the Gulf War, as the FBI confiscated them after the Oklahoma bombing. In the story of the OKC bombing and Tim McVeigh, bodies, or evidence of them, continue to disappear. Note: concerning Lieutenant Rodriguez's testimony that McVeigh took pictures of dead Iraqis, McVeigh said this was not true. This testimony was not malicious on his part, but just bad recall. "Someone on our vehicle did take such pictures, I don't wish to name him, but I felt it was just wrong, one of those intuitive feelings, like a desecration of the dead or something. I was even offered copies of these and declined. My Desert Storm photo album collection, confiscated by the FBI so they knew, had no such pictures, reinforcing this fact." In another conversation with his biographers, McVeigh said that the driver of his Bradley took pictures of dead bodies and gave him a copy. "We had a rapport, and he respected my ability. After the war, he gave me a set of his pictures. When he gave me that set, I went through them that day, with him right there in his house. I went through and I said I don't want these. The only ones I kept were of the destroyed vehicles and stuff. He was in a better position than me to take pictures because I was the gunner. I never had much chance to jump out of the turret and take pictures. When you're in a defensive position, driver doesn't have anything to do, but the gunner is constantly scanning. Lieutenant Rodriguez also took a set of pictures and gave me a copy of his. You can identify his photos by a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle in the corner of the photo. There were no dead bodies in my entire collection. After the harrowing 2.5 days of battle, orders changed, telling them to continue along Highway 8 and stop to secure El Bosna, a small town near the Iraq-Kuwait border, before heading to the Safwan airfield, where the official Iraqi surrender, ceasefire negotiations, and formal peace talks were scheduled to begin. Along the way, McVeigh and his friends observed similar horrors. On March 2nd, days after the ceasefire agreement and 1 day before the peace talks were to begin, artillery units from the 24th Division repeated the earlier Basra highway attack, this time concentrating solely on the smaller Highway 8. Abrams and Bradleys fired upon and killed retreating Iraqi soldiers and civilians, including children. General Barry McCaffrey, who commanded the attack, called it one of the most astounding scenes of destruction I've ever participated in. We destroyed all of them. Once we had them bottled up, there was no way out. Note: before heading towards the small town of El Bosna, McVeigh's division had to stop at Safwan airfield, where Saddam was to sign a surrender agreement and coalition, and Iraqis negotiated a ceasefire. Yet, much to the dismay of General Schwarzkopf, the 7th Corps had not secured the town of Safwan. Under direct orders from General Schwarzkopf, McVeigh's division continued towards Safwan. Upon arriving there, however, they learned that due to confusion resulting from the fog of war, the division tasked with ousting the Iraqis occupying the location had failed to do so. On March 1st, Major General Rame commanded Lieutenant Moreno to take his brigade and convince the Iraqis to leave peacefully or kill them. Moreno informed the Iraqi generals that they had 1 hour to vacate, threatening them with his impressive fleet of armored Bradley vehicles and Abrams tanks. After a Bradley almost ran over the car of one Iraqi general, they agreed to leave, and thus the 1st Infantry Division, this time with no shots fired, helped to end the war. On March 3, 1991, Schwarzkopf arrived at Safwan and met with Iraqi generals who agreed to the terms of withdrawal. Lowry described it as a day to remember, and one that would be burned in our memory and history books for decades to come. McVeigh's company performed security detail during the treaty signing ceremony. One soldier captured video footage of Schwarzkopf walking down the line shaking hands with members of the security detail, including McVeigh, who was beaming with pride. In 2011, Ray Barnes said their little peace treaty, despite the theatrics, was, for the most part, a big dog and pony show on some dinky little runway out in the middle of nowhere. President Bush announced the liberation of Kuwait and the end of the war. Officials declared Operation Desert Storm an overwhelming success. Throughout the war, Pentagon spokespeople claimed they could not release even estimated numbers of American casualties, as it could affect the safety and readiness of U.S. troops. During the daily morning Pentagon press briefings, the more than 500 on-location journalists covering the war expressed their displeasure with this, and complained about the inaccurate or wholly falsified information they continuously received, most notably about the dead. The official numbers the Pentagon would eventually release varied. In August 1991, they claimed the number of U.S. soldiers killed in action was 148, including 35 from friendly fire, and 467 more wounded, 72 from friendly fire. As for the number of Iraqi soldiers killed, well, nobody really knew, and military officials claimed that they had just not been keeping track, a lack of concern some linked to the negative effect official body counts had on public opinion during the Vietnam War. When asked about the number of dead Iraqi soldiers in March 1991, an unnamed Defense Intelligence Agency official remarked, "The guys in the field just weren't counting. They still aren't. They just poured them into common graves and covered them." A senior Allied officer in Riyadh offered what he called a ballpark figure of 100,000. In September 1991, the Pentagon claimed it was impossible to determine the total number of Iraqi soldiers who had died during the war. In a report to Congress that same month, Dick Cheney said only 457 Iraqi bodies had been found on the battlefield, but made no mention of the bulldozer assault. "We have no way of knowing precisely how many casualties occurred, and we may never know," Cheney concluded. Although for years General Schwarzkopf refused to give even an estimated count other than a very large number, in 2000 he said the number of Iraqi soldiers killed was tens of thousands. Independent estimates range from 10,000 to about 35,000, with about another 75,000 wounded. Estimated numbers of collateral damage, or Iraqi civilian deaths, based on Iraqi census reports and UN and other Allied totals, range from 3,664 to 103,500 during the war, and 205,500 more in the post-war period as a result of war-related damage to critical infrastructure. The U.S. claimed the number of surrendered or captured Iraqi POWs to be 110,000. Ultimately, the soldiers who fought with McVeigh during the Gulf War could not agree how many POWs their company had taken. Some claimed they had taken a considerable number, while others said none. At the beginning of the conflict, President Bush had reminded Americans that As a Navy pilot during World War II, he had personally seen the hideous face of war. For U.S. civilians, soldiers, and the rest of the world, the carnage in and around Basra Highway became emblematic of this ghastly face and a symbol whose impact would resonate for years to come. In Richard Lowry's uncritical and embarrassingly glowing military history of the U.S.'s first war with Iraq, he describes how, during his flight to the Safwan peace talks, Schwarzkopf observed the pitch-black smoke that filled the Kuwaiti air, the burning oil well fires, and the highway of death below. An early article about the incident warned that, in the coming years, it would be important to monitor the psychological state of U.S. troops who had been present, predicting they too would become psychological casualties of the atrocity. Since 1991, mass graves filled with suffocated Iraqis have continued to appear. In 2003, the Saudi military began digging up and moving the graveyard of wreckage that still inhabited Basra Highway and surrounding areas in preparation for the U.S.'s second war with Iraq, a mess so extensive that the cleanup was expected to take a division of 17,000 soldiers over a month to complete. In 2011, U.S. soldiers ordered to clean up hundreds of scorched corpses and carbonized bodies on Basra Highway continued to have flashbacks of what they saw there as they loaded the bodies into bags and dumped them in mass graves. In 2011, one soldier on the cleanup crew described frequently waking up from nightmares about dead women and children melted together. Ham described the end of the Gulf War as the high point in McVeigh's life, but also the beginning of his downward spiral. The grim and grisly impact McVeigh's travels on the long road to Safwan had on his frame of mind should not be underestimated. A sick, dog-eat-dog world. On March 8, 1991, McVeigh and his cohorts arrived at a small farming community off Basra Highway, where they remained for the next 10 days. McVeigh said the majority of Iraqi civilians, mostly women and children, were hungry as hell and continuously begged them for food. Sometimes he and the others shared their MREs, despite Lieutenant Rodriguez's contrary order because of what happened in Vietnam when the children would carry bombs. McVeigh even wrote home expressing his displeasure with the orders not to feed the starving Iraqi children. The actions of his fellow soldiers towards the Iraqis upset McVeigh as well. He spoke later about some of them who watched the women going to the bathroom at night with thermals as they passed civilian houses, an observation that led him to understand how technologically advanced Americans were and recalled how he felt offended by how much we intruded into their lives. Once Ray Barnes found a chest of tools and was in the process of taking them when a group of Iraqi civilians ran up screaming and accusing Barnes of stealing their tools. Another time, when they arrived in the town, the COs ordered McVeigh and some others to raid an abandoned motor pool where they procured an Iraqi tank and dragged it away as a souvenir. On March 17, 1991, McVeigh wrote to his sister telling her they were pulling back from the demilitarized zone and that the war had been a success for the United States, but added, "It's a sick dog-eat-dog world out there." That same day, Lieutenant Rodriguez returned to the States due to a death in his family, and McVeigh became the Bradley commander, in charge of about 36 men. That evening, McVeigh and two other soldiers he'd grown close to thumbed their noses at Rodriguez by placing cases of MREs and cans of fruit cocktail on the road for the hungry Iraqis. On March 24, 1991, a commanding officer pulled Sergeant McVeigh, now 22 years old, from routine duty and informed him that he had 30 minutes to pack his bags and prepare to leave. McVeigh and cohort Mitch Whitmire had received their long-awaited orders to head back to Fort Riley, gather their gear, and then report to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, by April 5th for the 21-day Special Forces Selection and Assessment Course. Gordon Blackcloud said McVeigh was excited and happy. He always thought he was ready and was ready in the Gulf when they transferred him. Cohort Maurice Ray said that when McVeigh left the Gulf, everyone thought he would make it. This had always been his goal, and he had, in the years they'd known him, trained very hard for this chance. While McVeigh also claimed later that he had been happy to receive the orders, other soldiers said he felt conflicted about it. Ray Barnes said, "Before he left the Gulf, he was nervous because he wasn't able to train. I know people that's gone into Ranger School at 180 pounds come out 150 or 145 pounds. In a letter he penned to Steve during his flight home on March 26, 1991, McVeigh admitted that he was concerned because class starts April 1st and I'm not in shape, and predicted, "My list of headaches to come is about a mile long." Note: Herbeck and Michael wrote that McVeigh, a highly respected non-commissioned officer, was happy and hopeful about his promising future. He had heroically contributed to the triumphant war effort, and his dream of becoming an elite warrior in the Green Berets was now in his grasp. However, Ham cited two other soldiers who said McVeigh had mixed feelings about leaving the Gulf and attending the Special Forces course, as his 4 months in the desert had physically and mentally taxed him, and he worried he was not ready for the extreme rigors of the SFCQ. While many people spoke of dramatic changes they observed after McVeigh's return from the Gulf War, a handful said they saw the subtle beginnings of this process before he left. They emphasized that his experiences there had made an immediate, marked, observable impression on him. Maurice Ray explained that many soldiers, including McVeigh, were very disappointed when the war ended and felt they should have been allowed to go into Baghdad and finish what was begun, a sentiment McVeigh expressed to his cousin who had also fought in the Gulf War. According to Sergeant Guest and fellow cohort Garrett Bessler, McVeigh's change in attitude became apparent after witnessing the deaths of surrendering Iraqis, which, they said, he found terribly disturbing. McVeigh, said Guest, had been visibly shaken up by the death and destruction, and started to feel disappointed about the views of the military and the unit in particular. Bessler said McVeigh was upset that they came all the way over and risked their lives for people to shoot at nothing. Many soldiers became disillusioned by the amount of unnecessary firing at Iraqis in the Gulf, and, Bessler admitted, "I thought I was losing my mind over there." Curtis Chandler explained how it was just very frustrating to have fought a war over oil, then to be pulled off and never complete the mission. All of us kind of wondered whether it was our war to fight and why we were fighting it. We all knew that nobody cared about Kuwait. All we cared about was that damn oil. It was kind of a common consensus among us that we were fighting a war over oil. Plus, of all the prisoners we took, I'll tell you right now, ain't one of them wanted to fight. Not one. They were without question just stuck out in the middle of nowhere with nothing. McVeigh later explained that he had previously believed they entered the war to protect the country, the U.S. Constitution, and innocent people, and only at the end did he wake up and realize that the war was all economics, and that he and his cohorts had been sent over there to protect big oil companies. He recalled their superiors' warnings of a horrible and evil enemy, but he now began to understand that the Iraqi soldiers he saw and killed on the front lines were just as human as the Americans. In an internal memorandum, the Jones team noted that when McVeigh spoke to them about the war, as well as the victims of Waco, he often welled up with emotion, and while his expressions were unquestionably genuine and real, the sympathy he displayed seemed irreconcilable with the striking insensitivity he showed toward the victims of the Oklahoma bombing. It was almost as if he had an insensitivity switch that churned off his feelings, and while his ability to do this had allowed him to get through the Gulf War, they believed it had also allowed him to do what he did in Oklahoma City without thinking about the human beings he was about to kill. The Jones team soon learned the full extent and capabilities of McVeigh's switch. In 1997, Mark Ham noted an overrepresentation of combat veterans among the prison population, and, drawing from a number of studies, discussed possible underlying psychological factors that led McVeigh to bomb the Murrah. Among them was the Army's training, fine-tuned over the years to remove soldiers' aversion to murdering other humans through highly calculated conditioning, which leads to a reflexive willingness to obey any orders, including killing. Once conditioned, soldiers retain the learned aggression and desire to kill, sometimes enacting this in the civilian world. Note, Ham's theories were based on studies of World War II veterans who, through repetitive military training, had been carefully conditioned to follow orders and trained in the art of killing. Once conditioned, they retained their need to kill. In their bloodlust, they tended, after leaving the theater of war, toward increasing acts of violence and aggression within the civilian world. Military training and conditioning, postulated Ham, may also account for the overrepresentation of Vietnam and Gulf War-era veterans within prison populations. Indeed, Lee Harvey Oswald, Texas bell tower sniper Charles Whitman, D.C. Beltway sniper John Allen Muhammad, Fort Hood shooter Major Nidal Malik, naval yard shooter Alex Alexis, serial killers Jeffrey Dahmer and Son of Sam David Berkowitz, and of course Timothy McVeigh, all had one thing in common. U.S. military training awakened their lust to kill and refined their ability to do it. A June 9, 2001 article in the Ottawa Citizen warned of the inevitability of other McVeighs strolling the streets of Canada with undiagnosed or untreated post-traumatic stress disorder, rendering them ticking time bombs waiting to explode. The article urged Gulf War and other combat veterans to seek treatment for PTSD symptoms, which included hyperawareness, sleep disorders, social isolation, panic attacks, anger management issues, depression, and suicidal thoughts. Note, McVeigh told his attorneys he had sought treatment for PTSD, but each time had decided not to pursue it as, "I didn't want to be known as someone with a mental illness." Further, like many others, he felt treatment was just an excuse, and that I should be able to handle it myself. I explore McVeigh's attempts to get help for his post-war difficulties in later chapters. In his 1995 book, On Killing, The Psychological Cost of Learning to Kill in War and Society, Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman, former Army Ranger, paratrooper, and instructor of psychology at West Point and military science at Arkansas State University, wrote that soldiers experience typical killing response stages during and after combat. The first, fear and concern, occurs prior to engagement with the enemy. In the second, soldiers rely upon their previous military training and desensitization to killing, and during the actual fighting, act reflexively and mindlessly. Immediately after, the heightened awareness and adrenaline produced during combat causes an exhilaration stage, which, for some, becomes addictive. According to Grossman, more often than not, soldiers come to experience remorse for their acts, eventually rationalizing and accepting them, but that the period between their exhilaration and remorse is the most powerful and overwhelming time for them. Nearly 20 years after the end of the Gulf War, Ray Barnes described exactly the type of combat exhilaration Grossman wrote about. Quote, "I'm not going to lie to you, I was scared over there. But at the time, I felt exhilarated. I mean, especially when you went out, you just didn't know if that was your last time. In a strange way, I'm a fear junkie. I like it. I felt alive. Your endorphins get going, and I remember seeing this laying on my cot reading a book, and I look up and there's a glowing ball, a shooting star. About that time, another little ball slams into it. Boom, and you can hear the shrapnel. They shot a Scud down. Then I remember we were securing the forward position for the battalion, and I was sitting out there, and all of a sudden, the sand just erupts. Our own people lobbing mortars at us. Actually, when I was over there, I wasn't worried about the enemy. I was worried about our guys killing us. We had chopper pilots melt down a 113 scout vehicle because it was out there in the horizon. It was all melted down. Following closely on the heels of the thrilling heights McVeigh experienced was a looming boredom. As he sat in the small Iraqi farming community, coming down from his battle high, he admitted to Steve in a letter that he was itching to torch something. The Army appreciated such itches and rewarded McVeigh for taking out the Iraqis. Included among these were the Good Conduct Medal, Army Commendation Medal for Valorous Achievement, Southeast Service Medal with 2 bronze stars for Meritorious Achievement, a Combat Infantry Badge for proficiency in the performance of duties under hazardous combat operations, National Defense Service Medal, and the Kuwait Liberation Medal. McVeigh's fellow soldier and friend, Ted Thorne, reflected on this and told the Jones team, "We were supposed to be tough guys, you know. They taught us how to be killers and then they send us back home to the real world. We're supposed to be normal people again, but it just don't quite work like that. An infantry unit is trained as killers. That's what an infantry person is. You can't just take a normal person and put them in there. It wouldn't work out." Another cohort later relayed his opinion that the post-OKC bombing media reports depicting McVeigh as a psychopathic killer were inaccurate. "The things we had to deal with, having to kill somebody, that was part of our job, and we did it, and it didn't make a difference how old or how young or how big or what color. It didn't matter. That went with the job. And Tim was responsible when it came to doing a job. He'd do it regardless of who or what. That's what we were trained to do, and that's what he did. He was one of the few people in the unit I trusted to have my back. The other guys, it didn't really hit them that if you go to war, you're going to have to kill somebody. That's what you're for, and most of the people couldn't comprehend that. Some people didn't take the job seriously, but Tim and I did. Tim and a lot of others became very disillusioned because of the stupidity displayed that got a lot of people killed. I remember being told by a full-bird colonial in basic training that if you had to kill a kid, kill them. The press is making him out to be a psychotic, crazy maniac that likes to kill people, and he's not like that. He's a soldier. He did what he was trained to do, and he did what he was told to do. Killing comes with our job." A cold coming. "And I looked and beheld a pale horse, and his name that sat on him was Death, and hell followed with him, and power was given unto them over the 4th part of the earth, to kill with sword, and with hunger, and with death, and with the beasts of the earth. And there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth of hair, and the whole moon became as blood." Revelation 6:8-12. Archival, oral, and journalistic records reveal the presence of other terrifying specters, seen and unseen, looming over McVeigh and his cohorts during their harrowing trek through the desert, that thus far have remained unexplored in previous biographical and explanatory accounts of the Oklahoma City bombing. Even as it was being waged, scientists described the Gulf War as an unprecedented atmospheric disaster, an enormous unplanned experiment in the atmosphere, and warned that the chemicals released during it would threaten all living things in the region for decades to come. Some of the oil well fires that burned throughout Iraq and Kuwait consumed nearly 3 million barrels, or 250 million gallons of oil a day, a tenth of that used worldwide daily, and scientists predicted that the fires, numbering in the thousands, would burn for years, although most were extinguished within 6 months after the war's end. Iraq claimed the fires resulted from Allied attacks, while Allied forces said the Iraqi army had set the fires. No matter who lit them, by March 2, 1991, thick clouds of flammable, poisonous, neurotoxic, carcinogenic, and sulfurous smoke, fumes, and gases had risen over 12,000 feet and spread in every direction, reportedly covering half of Kuwait. The sun was continuously blacked out, sand dunes turned black, and black rain fell over the region in a radius up to 800 miles. Soot from the fires covered uniforms, hair, and food. In April 1991, the U.S. Army Environmental Hygiene Agency conducted a risk assessment of the smoke, and similar related studies continued throughout the next 2 years. Note, the media reported that the invading Iraqis had purposely blown up a number of Kuwaiti oil fields, wells, storage tanks holding jet fuel and kerosene, installations and pipelines, and, in an act that constituted a war crime, threatened to blow up more as part of a scorched earth campaign against Kuwait. Iraq claimed the spill resulted from Allied bombings. The region's winds carried the fumes in all directions. The ongoing oil-fueled raids and oil spills did not affect the price of oil that, although fluctuating, had begun to drop as the value of defense-related stocks climbed. Although many had been lit earlier, the greatest amount of oil well fires set occurred after February 20, 1991. Aerial photos revealed several oil well fires in Kuwait, which Layden speculated might have been set by Iraqis hoping the smoke would shield their visibility from bombers or disrupt heat-sensitive munitions, or alternately may have been ignited by errant American strikes that hit the facilities by accident. U.S. commanders acknowledged setting some oil on fire in Iraqi defensive trenches. Beyond oil well fires, the spoils of war seeped into the sea as well. In January 1991, Saddam commanded his generals to begin opening pipeline valves leading to the Kuwait Sea, dumping millions of barrels of oil into it and resulting in the largest oil spill in history. The amount of oil spilled into the Kuwait Sea, estimated at 400 million barrels, was twice the size of any other oil spill in history, 25 times the size of the Exxon Valdez spill, and destroyed marine life and eviscerated seabirds, coral reefs, and turtles. McVeigh's fellow soldiers recalled seeing the fires and described the last days of their drive through the desert to the Jones team. Sergeant Host remembered seeing entire oil fields burning and said, The sky was black. It was gray the entire time we were there. At night, when you'd go to the telephone, you couldn't see the stars. At the time, it wasn't hard to breathe because all the fumes seemed to be going up high, but then later we really got hit with it when it started to rain, and it all came down. McVeigh said that he personally counted 50 oil fires and was able to take pictures of some of them, and recalled how, as they traveled along Basra on Highway 8, the carbon from the fires blackened the sky, and a coating of black soot covered the sand for acres. Soldiers stepping over it left white footprints. In addition to the oil fires, the Allies' use of depleted uranium on tank armor and artillery shells, and their bombing of Iraqi weapons facilities, had released even more poisonous chemicals into the atmosphere. McVeigh's division was among the thousands of U.S. troops exposed to DU, whose effects, after 1 hour of exposure, scientists equated to 50 chest x-rays. A British Atomic Energy Authority report leaked to The Independent in November 1991 said that when coalition troops exited the Gulf, they left enough DU behind to cause at least 500,000 cancer-related deaths, the exact tonnage of DU the U.S. left behind. Of course, this in no way reflected the other illnesses and adverse effects that the chemical nightmare would have upon the Iraqi population. Towards the conclusion of the war, U.S. military officials had advised soldiers and media outlets about the strong possibility that Iraq might deploy chemical weapons, but later denied that either they or Iraq had used them, although studies conducted by other countries after the war, as well as statements given by soldiers there, supported allegations that somebody had. In late February 1991, General Schwarzkopf publicly denied that Iraq was using chemical weapons, and National Security Advisor Robert Gates warned that Iraqi commanders who did so would face a war crimes tribunal. Still, even after the war was over, allegations and rumors that chemical weapons had been used continued to surface. In 1993, the concerns of veterans groups, researchers, and government officials prompted a Pentagon study inquiring into the possibility that U.S. soldiers in the Gulf had been exposed to chemical weapons, which was overseen by former Deputy Defense Secretary and current CIA Director John Deutsch. The study's 1994 report concluded that no evidence existed of Iraqi use of chemical or biological weapons or any exposure of U.S. service members to chemical or biological warfare agents in Kuwait or Saudi Arabia. The results were suspect, given that the head of the study, Nobel laureate Joshua Lederberg, had also been on the board of directors of American Type Culture Collection, a nonprofit company that made over 70 government-approved shipments of anthrax and other deadly pathogens to Iraq between 1985 and 1989. A similar investigation by a House Oversight Committee in 1996 led to revelations that for several days U.S. soldiers, in an attempt to destroy them, blew up munitions held in a storage bunker called Bunker 73 in Qamishia, 25 miles from the city of Basra. The munitions, mostly rockets, contained the nerve agent sarin, mustard gas, and other possible biological agents. In doing so, they released a cloud of, among other things, 7 tons of sarin into the air that, when carried by the winds, exposed untold numbers of people. Not knowing the bunkers contained rockets filled with sarin, they did not wear protective gear, and when chemical alarms went off alerting them to the danger, officers told troops they were faulty and ordered them to disconnect the alarms. While the number of Iraqis exposed to and affected by the sarin release remains unknown, over the years the official number of U.S. soldiers exposed continued to grow. At first, the DoD insisted no troops were exposed. In September 1996, the Pentagon issued a statement that 5,000 U.S. soldiers were exposed. By October 1996, after the Pentagon set up an information hotline, the number grew to 15,000. A retired Army general, whose troops had been camped within 15 miles of Bunker 73, put the number at 24,000 and expressed concern, as his soldiers had not worn gas masks. Newsday estimated the number at 29,000. As of 2013, the Pentagon's estimate of how many U.S. soldiers could have been exposed to the toxins released at Qamishia alone reached 100,000. Years later, the Defense Department revealed that the Pentagon's nuclear, biological, and chemical warfare logs, which tracked the chemical alarms, had mysteriously gone missing, a circumstance one military officer compared to the 18-minute gap on the Nixon-Watergate tapes. The missing records pertain specifically to entries from March 3rd through 12th, 1991, the period during which McVeigh and company trekked through the desert with the spoils of war darkening their path. One cohort said, "They sent me out in the middle of this wide ocean of desert, and there's about 50 dead sheep around me with no blood in sight on them. That's a good indication that some chemical agents were used." Similarly, cohort Sam Stansky, name changed, recalled, "They still say to this day that there were no chemicals released, but I think there was. For one, they used to go down and check the bunkers, clear out the bunkers, and there was a call come over the radio that said, 'No one go in the bunkers anymore,' because a soldier went down in and rubbed up against the wall and got a nerve agent on him. And so they had stopped that and just started blowing the bunkers up. There's a lot of things about the war that haven't been told and the government don't want told. One night when I was on guard duty in Desert Storm, a guy was standing next to me, and this is going to sound funny to you, but all of a sudden I saw a bright green glow that just floated through the air and it was all over the place. And I asked the guy next to me if he saw it too, and he said he did. That's stuff that's not being told." In 1995, Cohort Sergeant Guest opined that he could not legitimately say if we were or weren't exposed to nerve gas because of U.S. bombings of Iraqi munitions. and mused that they had only recently begun to learn about the toxicity of the air that swept over them during their trek through the desert. Somebody knew, though. A recently declassified memo dated March 23, 1991, and sent from the Army Central Command Nuclear, Biological, and Chemical, or ARCENT NBC, staff to the 18th Airborne Corps states, ARCENT has positive confirmation by urinalysis of CML chemical agent blister casualty in the 7th Corps. The memo went on to instruct that if asked by the press, spokespeople were to report that no chemical casualties had occurred. As of 2015, the estimated of the number of all U.S. soldiers exposed to nerve gas and other chemical agents is over 200,000. The realities of the Gulf War and later attempts to determine the truth were further complicated because, immediately after Iraq invaded Kuwait, the Defense Department sought and obtained approval by the Food and Drug Administration to administer a cocktail of experimental drugs to troops without their informed consent, claiming that to obtain such consent was simply unfeasible. The known experimental drugs administered included pretreatments and vaccines meant to counter the effects of chemical and biological weapons. At the time, the FDA had previously barred the use of two of them, botulinum toxoid and pyridostigmine bromide, on civilian populations, and botulinum specifically remains unapproved by the FDA for civilian use because of its adverse side effects. Further, the doses administered to soldiers during the Gulf War were estimated based on previous tests on actual guinea pigs, and the effects of the combined use of all the drugs had not been tested. For several days prior to the start of the ground war and throughout its duration, commanders ordered soldiers to take anti-nerve gas and anti-anthrax agents as well as BP pills, the latter meant to enhance the effectiveness of the former. If they refused, they were threatened with court-martials. Worse still, not only had informed consent requirements been bypassed, but the military kept no records of those who received widely distributed anthrax vaccines, BP pills, or botulinum shots, or the dosages administered. One Army reservist recalled that, upon receiving word of his impending deployment to Iraq in February 1991, he and his battalion were given vaccinations over the course of 3 days, until on the last day medics informed them they had received the entire required pre-deployment vaccination regimen. According to him, the series of vaccinations was designed to be given over an 8-month period, and we received it in 3 days. Upon conclusion of the vaccination process, we were told to turn in our personal shot records. You are required to keep those on your person at all times. We protested, but still had to turn them in. A few years later, when he went back to check his records, they had been destroyed. At least one U.S. Army doctor was court-martialed after refusing to dispense the daily dose of BP pills, whose effects on humans were unknown. Captain Yolanda Hewitt Vaughn, a former U.S. Army doctor, applied for conscientious objector status during Operation Desert Storm in December 1990, citing as her reasons the Nuremberg Principles and the experimental vaccines that her superiors forced her to administer. After the denial of her request for conscientious objector status, Hewitt Vaughn deserted, an offense leading to her conviction and a 2.5-year prison sentence. Another recalled how it was common knowledge that the BPs were untested. We knew it, and they, the Army, knew it. Basically, the drugs came down through Army channels as a prophylactic remedy for nerve gas. The orders were, just give them. You didn't have any choice. Their reasoning was, we're in a war, and we have to do unusual things. One soldier said, I took the tablets and I had a shot. They told us the tablets could possibly make us sterile. They said they didn't know, but you had to take them anyway. Some guys refused, but they made them. Yet another said, we popped the BP pills like aspirin. During the Gulf War, McVeigh was assigned to the 24th Division, mechanized, one of 2 divisions deployed to the Gulf earlier than others, a division journalist Gary Matsumoto said were likely candidates for the first round of experimental vaccines. Indeed, like the other soldiers, many of McVeigh's cohorts also reported receiving experimental and untested drugs, including anthrax vaccines and anti-anthrax agents, as well as dousing themselves with insect repellents with known detrimental side effects. A large number recalled commanders' orders not to speak about the classified shots they received. Tony Sykes, name changed, said, we were forced to take pills. We had to take them on direct order, and most of the guys didn't want to. We found out the pills were experimental, and no one was given a choice, so we were all guinea pigs for the government. Until 1993, I was led to believe that the shots and pills were classified and not to be talked about. Charlie Barton, name changed, said, I took the anti-nerve agent pills. I don't know if Tim did or not. I was about 20 miles from where Tim was when the first scuds came in, and they told us to take them. I was eating them like candy. I took them about once every 4 to 6 hours. McVeigh's cohorts also recalled warnings of what would happen to them if they refused. Ray Barnes said, we had to take the anti-botulism toxin. Everybody had to take that. This is how they put it. You volunteer to take it, or don't take it, and you'll get an Article 15, and then you'll be tried because you're disobeying an order in a time of war. Note, Steve Hodge, among others, told the Jones team that McVeigh later spoke with him about the shots they received in the Gulf, shots which they were told would protect them from the effects of chemical warfare. Sam Stansky elaborated, we were required to take shots for anthrax in case of a chemical attack. They brought around a consent or non-consent form for the anthrax shots, and there was a soldier or two in our company that said, no, I'm not consenting to this shot. and they called up the battalion, and the battalion commander sent down word, his response, which was, "I don't give a damn, they're taking the shot anyhow," and we were made to take the shot. Right on the box it said, "For test purposes only, not for human use." They were just forced to take the shot whether they wanted to or not. We also took anti-nerve agent pills. Shortly after the Gulf War ended, veteran advocacy groups became concerned about the growing number of returning troops suffering from a constellation of debilitating physical symptoms, which, despite their unknown origin, was collectively termed Gulf War Syndrome, or GWS. In late 1991, the Department of Veterans Affairs obtained congressional approval to create a Gulf War registry for veterans in order to track their movements in the Gulf, the extent of their exposure to toxic fumes from the oil well fires, and their current health status. Officials urged Gulf War veterans to report to their nearest VA for a medical screening to determine their exposure to a growing list of toxins beyond petroleum poisoning, including parasitic infection, depleted uranium, and chemical weapons such as sarin nerve gas, all later acknowledged as possible culprits in the GWS epidemic. In June 1993, officials in the Clinton administration publicly acknowledged that the depleted uranium, or DU, used on U.S. tanks and artillery shells may have contributed to the growing number of Gulf War veterans displaying symptoms related to GWS. The commander of Walter Reed Medical Center agreed, and during a congressional hearing that year, added oil well fires to the list of suspected causes. Note, the Veterans Administration in Buffalo, New York, began their Gulf War registry in August 1992, which by September 1992 had screened an estimated 150 Gulf War veterans of the 1,500 in the region, and by 1994, 466. However, despite the ostensible efforts to understand GWS and help the soldiers suffering from it, many times soldiers who later reviewed their military medical records, often in an attempt to understand their debilitating and relentless symptoms, found that several of the vaccines and medicines they were administered prior to and during the Gulf War were not noted in them. Other times, their records contained outright falsifications, and some were told their records had been destroyed because there had not been enough space to ship them back to the U.S. The Jones team found it odd that, given the barrage of shots and pills described by McVeigh himself as well as his fellow soldiers, upon their inspections of the available portions of his military medical records, there was no appearance of the shots and pills. Also absent from McVeigh's records are consent forms for any of the extensive medical treatments he received, including his military immunization records. In fact, the only entry in the available portion of McVeigh's military records for the entire duration of his Gulf War service appears on February 17, 1991, when he received the experimental botulinum toxoid inoculation shot, the day before the ground war started, and the same day that President Bush promised that Iraq's invasion of Kuwait would end very shortly. When asked about the lone botulism shot entry, McVeigh said he believed it was some kind of test vaccine, and that he and the others were used as guinea pigs. Although at the time he had asked around about what exactly the shots were, nobody would speak with him about it. Only later did he learn that one of the shots was an anti-anthrax inoculation, and that his unit had been given additional immunizations whose names and chemical compositions he still did not know. McVeigh further explained that upon arriving in the Gulf, they were ordered to take 2 kinds of pills, but after taking the first dose, he refused to take any more. He identified one of them as a nerve agent pill, but was unable to identify the other. He also described widespread use of the insecticide called DEET, one of the 67 insecticides and insect repellents used in the Gulf War, now linked to GWS. McVeigh said he never actually used the DEET because there were no insects, but did find it to be a good fire starter. Among the other Gulf War exposures McVeigh described to his attorneys was radioactive armor-piercing ammunition coated with depleted uranium, and he even had a picture of himself holding the weapon whose ammo he thought was radioactive, a 25mm APDST, or armor-piercing discarding sabot tracer. Having explained these exposures, McVeigh then helped his defense attorneys identify other strikingly absent portions of his records, including, among others, the entire Gulf War period and his later Special Forces tryout. The Jones team informed the court about the withholding of this and other critical information about their client, and obtained permission from the court to hire 2 experts to review the records they did possess, and to obtain those they did not. However, neither expert was able to do so. Note, in July 1995, the legal team would file an application for subpoena and supporting brief, and made it known to the court that the records provided are not complete. At this point, the Jones team hired a military records expert to suggest several locations where these records, notably those detailing his service in the Gulf, might be located, although ultimately the expert's suggestions did not lead to the Jones teams obtaining them. For this reason, by February 1996, the defense team successfully requested that the court allow them to replace their then-current military records expert with a different one. According to FBI records in the Jones collection, as early as 1995, an inspector general from the New York State Military Affairs Office with the rank of major provided the FBI and the Army's Criminal Intelligence Division in Fort Sill, Oklahoma, with some of the records. When he did so, the major advised the FBI that the documents can only be used for government purpose and are covered by the Privacy Act. On March 12, 1996, The Jones team's military records expert visited Fort Riley, but upon his return notified the team that he was not able to look at division files for the Desert Storm period, as these records had been sent to the Office of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in Washington, D.C. at their request. 2 days later, when the legal team contacted Captain Rodriguez, formerly lieutenant, to discuss certain aspects of Tim's records, he declined, explaining that 2 FBI agents instructed him not to discuss his knowledge of McVeigh or the contents of the records with anyone, especially the defense team. The Jones team soon realized that Fortier's military records were incomplete as well, and that immediately after the arrest of McVeigh, Nichols, and Fortier, the Pentagon had sealed the records of all 3. In March 1997, the Jones team noted that not only did they have incomplete military records for McVeigh, but also for Fortier and Nichols, and that further, within the records they did have, there were no medical or promotion records in Fortier's file, and no promotion orders in Tim's file. From October 1996 until the time of McVeigh's trial in 1997, internal defense memos reflect the Jones team's frustration with their efforts to locate and obtain the records, and ultimately their failure to do so. Almost as if McVeigh had known the records would be important later, he had, on at least 3 occasions prior to the bombing, requested a complete set from the Army, including his medical records. He had then sent them home to his father for safekeeping and instructed him to put them in a secure location. However, after his son's arrest, when the FBI appeared at Bill McVeigh's door, he willingly relinquished the records to the FBI. Indeed, the military records taken from Bill McVeigh's house appear within the U.S. Attorney's receipt for materials from the FBI. However, the Jones team realized that included among those items missing from the FBI's own search warrant inventory of what they took from the McVeigh home were McVeigh's pre-Gulf War military records, which included the many doctor visits, a record of the commendations from Desert Storm, and another packet of military records undescribed. Hence, the exact nature of the shots and pills administered, the location where he received them, or the doctors and medical staff present was and remains unknown. The Jones team's search for McVeigh's records coincided with national headlines that detailed the increasing number of Gulf War veterans who had developed the inexplicable Gulf War syndrome, an illness defined by multiple, highly individualized symptoms. Unknown and unreported in the media after his arrest was that McVeigh and many men in his unit were suffering from these symptoms. Like him, their records had been confiscated, misplaced, or destroyed. Note: in 1997, the Senate Armed Services Committee held hearings on the Military Personnel Review Act of 1997, which for the Jones team were of special concern because of the effect of the proposed legislation in cases where a military department has destroyed or misplaced its records, and because the legislation, if passed, would abrogate the rights service members have enjoyed since 1870. Although they could not obtain the complete set of records, including medical ones, the Jones team discovered discrepancies in information listed about McVeigh, specifically his height, and within internal memos discussed their need to have the complete records available to them in order to introduce portions into evidence during the upcoming criminal trial. Oddly, the list of symptoms commonly associated with GWS came to include hair loss, sore gums, persistent dreams and nightmares, muscle and joint pain, bleeding gums, rapid tooth decay in almost all teeth, unexplained vomiting and diarrhea, strange moles, skin growths, blurred vision, fatigue, anxiety, ulcers, and recurring skin scales and skin tags. The available portion of medical records reflects that during his 3 years in the Army, McVeigh sought medical attention on more than 70 occasions for all of these symptoms. The 25 most commonly reported symptoms of Gulf War syndrome are fatigue, skin problems, rashes, memory loss, blackouts, joint pain, headaches, personality changes, diarrhea, muscle pain, as in weakness, spasms, tremors, pain in the back, shoulder, neck, etc., vision problems, shortness of breath, sleep disturbances, hair loss, numbness in the extremities, bleeding gums, reproductive problems, chest pain, abdominal pain, fever, nausea or vomiting, dizziness, nasal discharges, and sensory sensitivity. Soon after McVeigh's arrest, the FBI confiscated Cohort Ray Barnes' Army photos and his service-related records, and in 2010, Barnes emphasized that, despite promises to return them, the FBI had yet to do so. Further, in September 1995, the FBI attempted to attain Barnes' extensive post-Gulf medical records, and ultimately issued a grand jury subpoena for them. Barnes was not alone. The FBI confiscated and misplaced or destroyed vital military records, photos, and other service-related mementos of several men in the cohort unit. Woody Davis recalled, "Somehow the FBI got my name immediately after the bombing, and came and took all this stuff, all the Army stuff, all my papers." Similarly, a frustrated Gordon Blackcloud said, "After the bombing, the FBI came and took my picture ID, social security card, medical records. I don't know why they took those. They never sent them back." McVeigh's hidden medical narrative continued after his return from the Gulf War and discharge from the military. So too did the attempt by many Gulf War veterans to obtain answers and treatment for their strange illness, though the very existence of GWS continued to be dismissed by many as psychosomatic hysteria and conspiracy theory. The National Defense Authorization Act for the 1997 fiscal year, finalized in September 1996, includes regulatory protocols for medical research involving human subjects, budgetary allotments totaling $10 million for independent research regarding Gulf War syndrome, and a clause regarding a Comptroller General review of healthcare activities of the Department of Defense relating to Gulf War illness. The clause dictates, among other things, that the Comptroller General would analyze the effectiveness of the DoD's medical research and clinical care programs, analyze the scope and effectiveness of DoD policies with respect to the use of investigational new drugs used during the Gulf War, the current use of investigational new drugs to treat Gulf War syndrome, and analyze the administration of medical records by the military departments in order to assess the extent to which such records accurately reflect the pre-deployment medical assessments, immunization records, informed consent releases, complaints during routine sick call, emergency room visits, visits with unit medics during deployment, and other relevant medical information relating to Gulf War veterans. A 1998 report by the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee described the story of soldiers' toxic exposures, which included the preventive measures administered to counter them, as one of inaccurate records and claims of Pentagon cover-up after the fact. It illustrates issues common to many other events during the Gulf War. In 2008, the DoD recognized GWS as a legitimate service-related illness, although by that time other related concerns had arisen. That same year, The Guardian reported that the dangers faced by soldiers in Iraq currently extend far beyond enemy fire or PTSD. The article described the region as among the most polluted on the planet, so toxic that merely to live, eat, and sleep, never mind to fight, in these zones is to risk death. Finally, in the early 2000s, newly returning soldiers began to report symptoms similar to their Gulf War I predecessors, the combination of which was dubbed the new Gulf War illness and the new Agent Orange. In 2012, after years of similar requests, denials and appeals, and strong opposition from the DoD, VA, and Halliburton, the DoD agreed to create a registry to track soldiers exposed to harmful chemicals in Iraq and Afghanistan. In June 2014, the VA launched the Airborne Hazards and Open Burn Pit Registry. As it turns out, thousands of soldiers returned from Gulf War II had likely been exposed to chemicals linked to the development of respiratory illnesses, cancers, and neurological problems. Medical studies have recently begun to link increasing incidences of Iraqi cancers, birth defects, and infant mortality and multi-symptom toxic exposures to the same neurotoxins that affected veterans of Gulf War I. In July 2014, EHS Today, an occupational safety journal, reported, contractors were assigned the task of properly disposing of any and all trash on military installations in Iraq, Afghanistan, and other locations in the Middle East. Instead of using incinerators, the contractors disposed of the waste through burn pits, and in the process exposed thousands of veterans to toxins that placed them at serious risk of respiratory illnesses, cancers, and other occupational diseases. The invisible Gulf War spectacle. In the many narratives told by McVeigh about events throughout his life, corpses appear, disappear, and reappear, a pattern best illustrated, and perhaps rooted, in his experiences during the Gulf War, a war whose carefully constructed spectacular primetime entertainment value qualified it as the first hyper-real postmodern info war. The mass-mediated murderous extravaganza masked its managers' surreal and brutal genocidal, ecocidal, and homicidal New World visions. It is difficult, if not impossible, to know exactly what occurred during the war, including who fired at whom, when and under whose orders Iraqis were buried with bulldozers, and how many met their deaths in this manner. Further, the unspeakable actions taken by McVeigh and his cohorts on the highway of death, or the details of the nightmarish visions they observed, are unknowable, as are the impact these had on them. Finally, among those things impossible to determine about the Gulf War is who exactly received the ostensibly preventative experimental shots and pills, who administered them, and when. Truth and consequences. The opaque nature of the First Gulf War should not lessen perception of its relevancy or relationship to McVeigh's role in the bombing of the Murrah Federal Building on April 19, 1995. Surely the traces of the Gulf War and the ghosts accompanying and perhaps driving him the morning he parked the deadly Ryder truck next to the building and walked away, heedless of the collateral damage, should not be ignored. During his 1997 sentencing hearing, when asked if he had anything to say for himself, McVeigh, in yet one more act of appropriation, quoted a statement made by Supreme Court Justice Louis D. Brandeis, explaining his dissenting vote in the 1928 case that normalized the use of wiretaps in criminal investigations. "Our government," he said, "is the potent, the omnipresent teacher. For good or ill, it teaches the whole people by its example." And then McVeigh added, "That's all I have." While he prepared for his execution, McVeigh explained to his biographers that the Gulf War had left him feeling as if he had become just like the bullies he despised growing up. Worse, he had done so on behalf of his country, whose actions he came to see as the epitome of hypocrisy. In 1998, McVeigh wrote a piece entitled Essay on Hypocrisy that he sent to media outlets. He described it as admittedly provocative and said that it had only created further public outrage towards him. In it, he compared the Oklahoma City bombing to the U.S.'s actions in Iraq. The U.S., he said, set the standard when it comes to the stockpiling and use of weapons of mass destruction. He noted that U.S. officials had explained the presence of any daycare located inside Iraqi government buildings as an Iraqi shield. How was it then, McVeigh asked, that the one in the Murrah, a government command and control center, was any different? In fact, he continued, the U.S. acknowledged it knew about children in or near Iraqi government buildings, but bombed them nonetheless, dismissing any non-military deaths as collateral damage. He pointed out that, although after the bombing the public lamented over the casualties and the media ceaselessly replayed images of dead children, both had failed to afford the Iraqi civilians who died during the Gulf War the same attention and respect. Whether you wish to admit it or not, when you approve morally of the bombing of foreign targets by the U.S. military, you are approving of acts morally equivalent to the bombing of Oklahoma City. Who are the true barbarians? In a letter written to Gore Vidal in April 2001, months before his execution, McVeigh explained further. Borrowing a page from U.S. foreign policy, I decided to send a message to a government that was becoming increasingly hostile. Bombing the Murrah was morally and strategically equivalent to the U.S. hitting a government building in Serbia, Iraq, or other nations. Based on observations of the policies of my own government, I viewed this action as an acceptable option. From this perspective, what occurred in Oklahoma City was no different than what Americans rain on the heads of others all the time, and subsequently my mindset was and is one of clinical detachment. The bombing was not personal, no more than when Air Force, Army, Navy, or Marine personnel bomb or launch cruise missiles against foreign government installations and their personnel.